6 years ago, they told me my daughter survived the crash, but no longer wanted to see me. Every January after that, I wired $40,000 to the private recovery program where she was supposedly rebuilding her life without me. I thought I was paying for her safety. Then a courier placed a notarized property transfer on my desk with my daughter's fresh signature, dated 12 days earlier. The signature was clean, steady, deliberate, nothing like the shaky hand of a broken woman hidden in treatment. That was the moment I understood I had not been funding her recovery. I had been funding the lie that kept her away from me. The paper smelled like cold rain and printer toner. My thumb stalled on the loop of her last name because fathers know their children's handwriting the way mechanics know the sound of a loose belt. I had spent years training myself not to demand direct proof because every demand was treated like a threat to my daughter's peace. The document ended that training in one glance. From then on, every memory rearranged itself around a simpler fact. If Leah could sign a property rider, then someone had built an entire economy around keeping me grateful for my own exclusion. For the rest of that afternoon, I could not settle into any normal sequence of action. I opened drawers and closed them again, signed 2 delivery approvals without reading them, and then had to call accounting back because the names swam on the page. I kept returning to the date beside Leah's signature, as if numbers themselves might change under enough pressure from my eyes. They did not. 12 days earlier, while I sat at my own desk believing my daughter still lived inside a distant therapeutic haze, she had been signing documents linked to a property I had never heard of. The cruelty of the thing was its cleanliness. No dramatic threat, no masked man, just an ordinary transfer, and a father finally noticing the paperwork had stopped pretending. I am telling you this from the first person because that matters. For too long, every crucial sentence in my family came through intermediaries, consultants, spouses, summaries, care notes, review memos. If this story has any moral center at all, it is that love cannot survive forever once other people monopolize translation. I remember saying out loud to an empty office, "Leah is alive enough to sign this, so who the hell have I been paying all these years?" Once you read a date like that, you cannot go back to polite explanations, professional updates, or the careful language people use when they want your money to keep moving. You either start pulling on the thread, or you choose your own blindness. Maybe that is why the hook of the story is so simple. A fresh signature on an ordinary piece of paper cut through 6 years of managed fog, faster than any dramatic clue ever could have done. I no longer underestimate clerical truth. It has no need to perform. It simply sits there until someone honest enough or desperate enough finally reads it properly. Maybe that is why the hook of the story is so simple. A fresh signature on an ordinary piece of paper cut through 6 years of managed fog, faster than any dramatic clue ever could have done. I no longer underestimate clerical truth. It has no need to perform. It simply sits there until someone honest enough or desperate enough finally reads it properly. That was the first honest second I had lived through in years. And honesty has a way of making every previous compromise look both smaller and more humiliating than it did while you were still inside it. My name is Daniel Mercer. I am 68 years old, a widower, and for most of my life I believed decent work could solve almost anything if you stayed steady long enough. I built Mercer Supply from one cinder block warehouse and a borrowed forklift into a regional building materials business people around Harrisburg knew by name. I liked ledgers that balanced, trucks that started on the first turn, and promises that did not need witnesses. My wife Helen used to say I trusted routine more than I trusted wisdom. She taught music at the middle school and could look straight through people who wore concern like a costume. Mercer Supply gave me a reputation for being steady, and steady men are easy to fool in one very specific way. We mistake endurance for discernment. We think because we can carry weight for a long time, we must also know what deserves to be carried. I carried lies for 6 years because they arrived dressed as responsibility, and responsibility has always been my favorite disguise for fear. Men from my part of Pennsylvania grow up on a certain mythology of usefulness. Keep your truck serviced, your receipts straight, your word better than your temper, and life will at least make sense even when it is cruel. I believed that for decades. It carried me through inventory shortages, bad winters, union headaches, a flood in Warehouse B, and the months when Helen was sick enough that every ordinary sound in the house started to feel guilty for continuing. What I had never considered was that my greatest weakness might be the same trait everybody praised in me. I was reliable. Reliable people are easy to draft into somebody else's structure if the structure flatters their sense of duty. Nothing in my early life prepared me for this, except perhaps the warehouse itself. Warehouses teach you that what gets stacked out of sight can still determine the whole building's risk. Rot at the base, hidden damage behind clean labeling, one overloaded shelf above eye level. I understood all of that in business, and almost none of it in grief. When she wanted to humble me, she would stir her tea and say, "Daniel, A neat schedule is not the same thing as a well-protected life. She died 8 years before the document showed up on my desk. Pancreatic cancer. Fast, disciplined, merciless. I have had enough time since then to learn that grief does not leave. It just gets better at standing quietly in the corner until a new disaster invites it back into the middle of the room. When I say I built a business, I do not mean I became rich in the cinematic way people imagine. I mean I became legible to banks, vendors, and employees. Predictable, solvent, responsible. Those traits later made me exactly the sort of man a long fraud prefers. Men who live chaotically are difficult to budget. Men who live dutifully can be harvested in regular installments. When I say I built a business, I do not mean I became rich in the cinematic way people imagine. I mean I became legible to banks, vendors, and employees. Predictable, solvent, responsible. Those traits later made me exactly the sort of man a long fraud prefers. Men who live chaotically are difficult to budget. Men who live dutifully can be harvested in regular installments. If life had stayed ordinary, that might have remained my whole biography. Widower, supplier, reliable man with a neat desk and a daughter he adored. Instead, ordinary life turned out to be exactly the camouflage the next disaster needed. Leah was our only child. She had Helen's patience, my stubbornness, and the kind of handwriting that leaned forward as if every sentence were already late for something important. She was 31 when the crash happened, a landscape architect with a habit of carrying plant clippings home in damp paper towels and naming every neglected little tree she tried to save. When she was 10, she once cried over a storm drain because a sparrow was trapped below the grate. She made me fetch bolt cutters from the warehouse, and we spent an hour freeing a bird that rewarded us by flying straight into my forehead. Leah grew into the kind of adult people trusted with projects that needed both vision and patience. She could stand in an ugly lot and describe shade, drainage, habitat, and the future shape of a path as if the place were already becoming itself under her gaze. That was one reason the lie worked so well later. Anyone trying to control her life needed first to convince her that her own instincts had become dangerous to follow. Even as an adult, Leah retained the irritating and beautiful habit of challenging any explanation that sounded too convenient. She once sent back a whole planning proposal because a city consultant wrote the phrase, natural user flow 3 times, without specifying what actual people had ever been asked where they liked to walk. That memory haunted me later, because it made the scope of what had been done to her feel even worse. To neutralize a person like Leah, you do not merely confine her. You first have to train her to distrust the part of herself that notices when language is cheating. Helen used to joke that Leah would someday either run a design firm or reorganize heaven's landscaping without permission. The joke hurts now, but in a useful way. It reminds me that her core self existed long before Stonebrook, and therefore could not be fully authored by the people who tried to make dependence look like destiny. Helen laughed for days and told everyone at church, "Our daughter has already decided the world is repairable, and Daniel has no choice but to finance the mission." That was Leah. Even grown, even busy, even impatient, she moved through the world as if damaged things deserved one more chance, which is why what was done to her later felt so obscene. People took her best instincts and built a cage around them. I still keep one of Leah's old sketchbooks from college in my desk. There are notes in the margins about runoff paths, roots under stress, species that survive transplant better than expected. I looked through it after the arrest and thought how fitting it was that my daughter had spent her adult life studying what living things need in order to recover from disturbance. She deserved that same patience from us. Instead, she got people who monetized the disturbance itself. I still keep one of Leah's old sketchbooks from college in my desk. There are notes in the margins about runoff paths, roots under stress, species that survive transplant better than expected. I looked through it after the arrest and thought how fitting it was that my daughter had spent her adult life studying what living things need in order to recover from disturbance. She deserved that same patience from us. Instead, she got people who monetized the disturbance itself. It mattered later that she had always been so willing to believe damaged things could still be tended back toward health. The people who trapped her studied that instinct and learned how to make it collaborate in her own confinement. 3 years after Helen died, I married Elise. Even now, I dislike writing that sentence because it makes the decision sound clean, and it was never clean. It was loneliness dressed up as readiness. Elise worked for a philanthropic foundation that sponsored hospital wings, arts galas, and the kind of polished charity dinners where grief and money always seemed to find each other at the same table. She was composed, attentive, unhurried. She knew how to ask just enough about Helen to seem respectful and just enough about my business to seem admiring without looking interested. Looking back, I can chart every warning I downgraded into inconvenience. Elise never forgot anything that made another person feel briefly seen. She also never volunteered a personal story that could be checked cleanly later. At the time, I called that elegance. In plain language, it was design. She was always building the room before the rest of us realized we were already standing in it. When Helen was alive, our house had texture. Music scales from the study, pots boiling over because she was reading while cooking, Leah dropping in with muddy boots and cut flowers from some site she swore was almost ready to thrive. After Helen died, the house became efficient, clean enough, quiet enough, too willing to accept a woman like Elise as evidence that order and companionship could coexist without asking whether the order had been arranged mainly to make companionship look inevitable. I did not marry Elise because she dazzled me. I married her because she made absence feel less audible for a while. If I sound unforgiving toward myself in this section, it is because self-pity would be too easy and not especially instructive. I do not need to be flogged forever for missing what I missed, but I do need to remain honest about how much of manipulation depends on the target wanting relief more than scrutiny for just long enough. Leah once told me, not cruelly but very clearly, "Dad, she is always acting like she is one sentence ahead of everybody else." I laughed it off because I was tired of hearing my own house echo. That is one of the smaller shames in this story, but it still matters. The people who end up destroying you rarely arrive wearing obvious malice. They arrive useful. They arrive sympathetic. They arrive at exactly the moment you are most willing to call relief by the wrong name. Some readers or listeners may want me to tell them the exact moment I should have known Elise was false. I cannot. Human deception usually denies us that convenience. What I can tell you is that every memory of her now carries too much surface and not enough weight. Like beautiful wrapping around a box that always seemed already closed before anyone else touched it. Some readers or listeners may want me to tell them the exact moment I should have known Elise was false. I cannot. Human deception usually denies us that convenience. What I can tell you is that every memory of her now carries too much surface and not enough weight. Like beautiful wrapping around a box that always seemed already closed before anyone else touched it. I do not say any of this to pretend I was bewitched. I say it because loneliness does not make a person stupid, only willing to translate red flags into companionship when the house has been quiet for too long. The official story began with rain. Leah was driving back from a site visit near York on a Thursday evening in November when a pickup hydroplaned across the median and clipped her car hard enough to spin it into a guardrail. She survived. 2 broken ribs, a concussion, deep bruising, lacerations to her shoulder, and one ugly head injury that sounded less severe every time some specialist translated it into language designed to calm families. When I first saw her in the hospital, she knew me. She knew the date. She knew Helen had hated hospital pudding and would have made jokes about the curtains. She was groggy and hurting, but she was Leah. Hospitals create a false sense of collective honesty. White coats, monitors, clipboards, hourly updates, names on doors. You start to assume any lie told inside that machinery will get caught by the machinery itself. It does not. Hospitals treat bodies. Fraud prefers the family members pacing outside the room with coffee they forgot to drink and a willingness to sign anything that sounds like hope. In the beginning, I treated every post-crash complication as part of the storm. Anyone would. You expect concussions to distort mood, pain to shorten patience, fear to make a bright, capable woman suddenly look lost in a hospital corridor. I told myself the specialists were simply being more sophisticated than the blunt old instincts I trusted. That is one reason bad systems thrive. They recruit our better impulses against us. Humility, deference, willingness to listen, fear of doing more harm. None of those things are shameful on their own. They only become lethal when handed to the wrong interpreter. The crash itself was terrible. I do not minimize that. Real injury creates the opening through which secondary predators move. Their later fraud did not mean Leah was never hurt. It meant hurt became a market around her faster than I understood, and markets are very hard to shut down once enough people begin calling them care. She squeezed my fingers and whispered, "Dad, I am okay, just embarrassed that I got beaten by weather in a red pickup." That memory mattered later because it was the last clean one. Everything after that was managed through filters, professionals, schedules, and the slow replacement of direct truth with authorized explanation. If you have ever loved someone through a real hospital stay, you know how quickly a family becomes administratively porous. People sign where they are pointed, nod when tired, forget who already called, and become grateful for anyone willing to organize the flood. That vulnerability is not stupidity. It is fatigue under moral pressure. Predators know the difference and do not care. If you have ever loved someone through a real hospital stay, you know how quickly a family becomes administratively porous. People sign where they are pointed, nod when tired, forget who already called, and become grateful for anyone willing to organize the flood. That vulnerability is not stupidity. It is fatigue under moral pressure. Predators know the difference and do not care. If the story had remained a story about weather, pain, and ordinary recovery, I could have lived with it. Hard stories still belong to life. What I cannot forgive is what came after, the conversion of injury into opportunity. Elise inserted herself almost immediately. At first, I was grateful. She handled insurance calls, brought clothes to the hospital, kept food in my kitchen, fielded relatives. The first week after the crash, Leah had headaches, panic spikes, and moments where sound seemed to hurt her. Nothing impossible. Nothing outside the range of what a serious concussion can do. Then Dr. Rowan Vale appeared. Rowan was not technically a neurologist, though he spoke in that broad, polished tone certain consultants use when they want ordinary people to stop asking what their actual credentials are. He called himself a post-trauma recovery strategist. Even now, that title makes me want to put my fist through a wall. Rowan's genius, if I am allowed to use that word for something so rotten, was tonal. He never sounded theatrical. He sounded reluctant, as if every expensive recommendation pained him on our behalf. He knew how to borrow the moral authority of medicine without committing himself to the parts of medicine that can be audited. By the time I understood that difference, he had already been billing my guilt for months. The most dangerous professionals are not always the loud ones or the obviously vain ones. Sometimes they are the ones who keep offering to reduce complexity for a family too exhausted to contest the summary. Rowan did that from day one. He took Leah's injury, grief, panic, and ordinary post-trauma unpredictability and rearranged it into a model that just happened to require him indefinitely. If he had sounded hungrier, I might have seen him sooner. Instead, he sounded burdened, responsible, almost sacrificial. It turns out predation wears martyrdom beautifully when the invoice language is good enough. I have since listened back to recordings of Rowan from public panels and online seminars. He sounds the same in all of them. Thoughtful, integrated, humane. That consistency used to impress me. Now it terrifies me. Monsters who improvise can be caught by mood. Monsters who standardize themselves become a process problem first and only later a moral one. He sat in a corner of Leah's hospital room and told me, her body will heal faster than her emotional architecture. Families often mistake proximity for care. In cases like this, space is sometimes the kindest medicine. The sentence was absurd. It should have sounded absurd, but he said it softly with diagrams, handouts, and carefully rationed compassion. And when a man is scared for his child, absurdity presented in a blazer can sound an awful lot like expertise. Years later, when Dana summarized the case for a training group, she said Rowan specialized in converting understandable distress into billable complexity. I wish I had heard that sentence back then. It might have saved us. Then again, maybe all good warnings arrive one tragedy too late for the people who needed them first. Years later, when Dana summarized the case for a training group, she said Rowan specialized in converting understandable distress into billable complexity. I wish I had heard that sentence back then. It might have saved us. Then again, maybe all good warnings arrive one tragedy too late for the people who needed them first. After the first week, Rowan was as present in our lives as any relative, which should have alarmed me. Instead, I called him dedicated. There are entire industries built on the difference between those two words. Within 3 weeks, Rowan and Elise had built a new reality around the accident. Leah, they said, was not simply recovering. She was fragile, unstable, emotionally reactive, prone to identity looping around old grief, especially around her mother's death and the pressure she associated with me. They said my presence triggered a complicated guilt response, as if a father sitting beside his daughter had somehow become a harmful stimulus. I pushed back at first. Leah wanted me there. I knew what I had seen in the hospital, but by then they had a whole vocabulary waiting for me. Attachment stress, memory burden, traumatic linking, destabilizing familiarity. Every plain question I asked got answered with a longer and more expensive phrase. If you want to isolate someone without calling it isolation, you do not forbid contact outright. You medicalize timing. You turn ordinary longing into a symptom. You describe direct love as pressure and filtered access as support. By the time families notice what has happened, they are no longer arguing over facts. They are arguing inside a vocabulary that already belongs to the people controlling the gate. I remember the first night I slept through my phone because Rowan had promised any real emergency would come through the residence directly. I woke at 3 a.m. sick with guilt and found no message. Relief felt disgusting. I had already begun outsourcing my relationship to a system. That is how separation dug in, not with one hard cut, but with hundreds of tiny permissions. Let us hold the phone tonight. Let us summarize her week. Let us review your letter before we decide if it helps. Let us protect the work that is happening here. Every let us was really a way of teaching me that fatherhood now required authorization. There were nights I told myself Helen would have known what to do sooner. Maybe she would have. Or maybe she would simply have asked the plain question I kept postponing, because plain questions felt embarrassingly unsophisticated beside Rowan's polished models. Where is my daughter, and why can I not see her? Sometimes courage is nothing more than refusing to let jargon outrank a simple necessary sentence. Elise cried once in my kitchen and said, "Daniel, if love means anything right now, it means not making yourself the center of what she needs. That line should win awards for cruelty, because that is how the trap worked. They did not tell me to stop loving Leah. They told me the purest form of love was distance, money, and obedience. The saddest part of those first months is that I thought I was being brave by staying away. I told myself, real fathers accept painful expertise when love demands it. I dressed avoidance up as sacrifice because sacrifice feels nobler than confusion. That is one more reason I tell the story plainly now. Noble-sounding mistakes are still mistakes. The saddest part of those first months is that I thought I was being brave by staying away. I told myself real fathers accept painful expertise when love demands it. I dressed avoidance up as sacrifice because sacrifice feels nobler than confusion. That is one more reason I tell the story plainly now. Noble-sounding mistakes are still mistakes. Every lie after that gained force not because it was especially brilliant, but because it fit the first lie so neatly. If contact was harmful, then delay was kindness. If delay was kindness, then payment was duty. If payment was duty, then questioning the bill became selfishness. That is how a system closes around you. By January, Rowan had placed Leah in what he called a private transitional recovery residence outside the city. I never saw the place. There was always a reason: too much stimulation, medication changes, structured silence periods. Then came the money. $40,000 for the first annual care package, supplemental support for personal supervision, additional fees for low-trigger living arrangements. Each invoice carried soft wording and hard totals. I paid because guilt is expensive when professionals polish it for you. I paid because Helen was gone and I could not bear the thought of failing Leah too. I paid because Elise signed every request with some version of, "I know this is difficult, but she is calmer when she knows you are helping quietly." The invoices were masterpieces of plausible cruelty. Enough itemization to calm a businessman. Not enough transparency to invite an accountant. Enough human language to keep a father ashamed of hesitating. Not enough clinical specificity to expose a real treatment model. When I review them now, I can almost admire the discipline it took to make theft look so much like concern without ever once becoming verifiable care. I have since shown those invoices to accountants, prosecutors, therapists, judges, and once to a retired hospice administrator who went silent for a full minute before saying, "They formatted despair very well." That may sound darkly funny. It is also correct. The forms were built to soothe the exact kind of man I was, not careless enough to ignore totals, not suspicious enough to reverse search every administrative phrase. They counted on me reading cost as sacrifice, and sacrifice as proof that something valuable must surely be occurring somewhere beyond my reach. Money left my account on schedule for so long that the transfers became ritual. January, then review, then supplemental adjustments. Ritual has a narcotic effect. It lets people believe continuity itself proves legitimacy. In truth, continuity only proves repetition, and repetition can sustain a lie beautifully if enough people are being paid to keep the forms neat. The first time I hesitated, Rowan called and said, "I need you to decide whether you want to be her father or another source of administrative uncertainty." I wired the money within the hour. That is one of the ugliest truths I know now. Predators do not always threaten directly. Sometimes they make decency feel like negligence and hesitation feel like harm. I no longer send money anywhere without reading every line. That may sound like a small practical lesson compared to everything else, but it matters. Control often survives by teaching decent people that scrutiny is somehow beneath love. It is not. Honest care welcomes review. Only exploitation needs gratitude to function as its shield. I no longer send money anywhere without reading every line. That may sound like a small practical lesson compared to everything else, but it matters. Control often survives by teaching decent people that scrutiny is somehow beneath love. It is not. Honest care welcomes review. Only exploitation needs gratitude to function as its shield. I tell you about the invoices because money leaves tracks even when people think emotion will hide them. Years later, those tracks became some of the cleanest evidence we had. 6 years passed that way, not all at once, but in emotionally exhausted installments. Leia's updates came through Elise or Rowan. Some months hopeful, some months vague, some months too clinical. She was progressing, but not ready. Writing, but not prepared to send letters. Asking about me, but not ready for contact. Settling into a lower stimulation pattern. Rebuilding self-trust. Learning not to attach healing to old family pressures. I wrote to Leah anyway. Birthdays, Christmas, spring, random Tuesdays when I missed her handwriting so much my chest hurt. I sent stories from the warehouse, bad jokes Helen would have liked, photos of the dog, little descriptions of weather she used to love. I never got a reply. Rowan said letters were being screened and stored so they could be introduced later in a way that supported therapeutic pacing. Those years should not be reduced to repetition, even though repetition is exactly how the damage was maintained. Each season carried its own little recalibration of hope, a better month, a worse month, a possible future visit, a postponed review, a not yet padded with gratitude for my patience. The genius of the scheme was not that it denied me everything. It fed me just enough future to keep me paying for the present. When people hear 6 years, they imagine one long, flat wasteland. In truth, it was textured. One spring there was talk of phased reintroduction. One autumn, Rowan said Leah was trying art again and that direct contact might soon be supportive. At Christmas 2 years in, Elise held my hand by the tree and said, "I think next year will be different." That sentence alone cost me at least $20,000 in renewed faith. Hope is very easy to counterfeit when the person hearing it has already invested too much shame to ask for a refund. I often think about the birthdays. Not because they were the worst dates, but because birthdays are supposed to resist bureaucracy. Every year I sent gifts, Rowan deemed potentially overstimulating, and cards Elise said would be kept until Leah could receive them without emotional destabilization. Imagine a system so arrogant it believes it can warehouse birthdays until clinically convenient. Every time I asked when later would be, Elise would squeeze my wrist and say, "Sooner if we stay patient, Daniel. Later if we rush." If you repeat that sentence to a lonely father for 6 years, you can steal almost anything from him and still call it care. There were whole stretches where I nearly accepted that this was simply what later life looked like. A grown daughter somewhere beyond my reach, a new wife translating updates, money leaving quietly, the house continuing around, an absence no one was allowed to call unnatural. People can normalize almost any arrangement if it is introduced slowly enough and wrapped in enough therapeutic caution. There were whole stretches where I nearly accepted that this was simply what later life looked like. A grown daughter somewhere beyond my reach, a new wife translating updates, money leaving quietly, the house continuing around, an absence no one was allowed to call unnatural. People can normalize almost any arrangement if it is introduced slowly enough and wrapped in enough therapeutic caution. By the 6th year, absence had been normalized so carefully that I had started arranging my own pain around their updates instead of around truth. That is what good manipulators want, not your belief all at once. Your adaptation, one reasonable compromise at a time. The document that shattered everything arrived on a Tuesday in March. A courier from a title company came to my office needing a signature acknowledgement for a package misrouted from one Mercer address to another. I nearly sent it back unopened. Then I saw the property name on the cover sheet, Stonebrook Residence Holdings. There was no reason for that to mean anything to me. But names are strange. Some land in the body before they make sense to the mind. Inside was a trust transfer, a maintenance authorization, and a notarized occupancy rider signed by Leah Mercer 12 days earlier. The notary stamp was real. The date was fresh. The pen pressure in her signature was firm enough to punch lightly through the paper. I have replayed that afternoon so often I know where the light fell across the grain of my desk when I unfolded the transfer. I know the courier's wet footprints near the threshold. I know the way the office hum sounded suddenly too loud. Truth does not always arrive like thunder. Sometimes it arrives with a clipboard and leaves before you have even understood you are looking at the edge of a cliff. Ordinary bureaucratic error deserves more respect than most of us give it. Systems built by manipulative people often survive not because they are perfect, but because the world around them remains predictable enough to compensate for their flaws. The day that envelope reached me, predictability failed on their side for once. A title clerk mistyped a forwarding code. A courier followed the printed label instead of the verbal note. My office manager happened to be out to lunch, so the package came directly to me. Fate is too dramatic a word for it. Negligence, perhaps. Providence, if you are religious. I have stopped trying to choose between the two. Somewhere in a drawer I still have the courier stub with his hurried initials and the timestamp from reception. I doubt I will ever throw it away. People imagine revelations come attached to dramatic objects. Guns, photographs, hidden keys. In my life, revelation came attached to a route sheet and a bored man's wet jacket. I remember tracing the L in Leah with my thumb and saying, No, this is not from a woman hidden away from paper and people. This is from someone living in the world. I did not call Elise first. That choice may have saved everything. Once fear has a paper trail, you do not hand the paper back to the people selling you the fear. I asked the courier his name months later and sent him a bottle of decent bourbon he probably did not drink himself. He looked embarrassed and said he had only been doing his job. Exactly. Sometimes justice starts because one person simply follows the label instead of the atmosphere. I asked the courier his name months later and sent him a bottle of decent bourbon he probably did not drink himself. He looked embarrassed and said he had only been doing his job. Exactly. Sometimes justice starts because one person simply follows the label instead of the atmosphere. I still send the man a Christmas card. He never understands why I write so much in it. I suspect I never will explain the whole thing to him. Some people save your life simply by being slightly more careless than the people trying to run it. I went home that evening and did something I should have done years earlier. I stopped reading the invoices as a worried parent and started reading them as a businessman. Logos shifted from year to year. Mailing addresses changed by single suite numbers. Rowan's title evolved in suspiciously elegant ways. Director of Recovery Oversight became Clinical Supervisor Transitional Resilience. Soft language everywhere, no actual facility license numbers that survived a serious search. By midnight, my dining table was covered in 6 years of payments, courier slips, polite lies, and my own handwriting in the margins asking questions I had apparently been too lonely to insist on answering. Once suspicion gets a ledger, it becomes difficult to put it back into feeling. Every irregular address, every repeated phrase, every invoice category shaped not by medical need, but by extraction, started tightening into something more rigid than dread. This was not chaos, not an accident, not a messy family improvising around illness. It was choreography. Somebody had done enough of this kind of thing to know exactly how much detail keeps a decent man from asking for the wrong receipt. By the second hour at my dining table, I was no longer revisiting the past. I was auditing it. That shift matters. Emotion asks whether something hurts. Audit asks what supports the injury and who signed off on its continuation. Dates began lining up around holidays and annual liquidity. Supplemental requests followed tax settlements and dividend distributions with almost predatory elegance. I realized then that the people controlling Leah's life understood my calendar nearly as well as my own CFO did. They had not simply inserted themselves into our tragedy. They had learned its rhythms and billed accordingly. I found receipts for things no recovery program in the world should have billed me for. Seasonal landscaping at market rates, imported kitchen fixtures, high-end linen services, a conservatory glass repair. None of it looked incriminating until you remembered the supposed patient was too emotionally unstable, according to them, to read a letter from her own father without risk. I said to the empty house, either I am a fool or somebody has built an industry around my daughter's absence. Those two possibilities are not as different as men like me prefer to think. By that stage, I had stopped praying for good explanations and started praying for usable facts. It was a healthier prayer. Good explanations would only have softened the eventual anger. Facts gave us something harder, and harder turned out to be kinder in the long run. By that stage, I had stopped praying for good explanations and started praying for usable facts. It was a healthier prayer. Good explanations would only have softened the eventual anger. Facts gave us something harder, and harder turned out to be kinder in the long run. I had always believed fraud announced itself through obvious greed. I learned instead that the best fraud arrives padded with enough emotional language to make refusal look cruel. The next person I called was Nora Klein, private investigator, former fraud analyst, divorced twice, patient with documents, impatient with performance. Helen had used Nora once when a vendor tried to bury an insurance discrepancy under church-friendly smiles. I trusted Nora because she had never once wasted a syllable trying to make me comfortable. She arrived the next morning in a dark coat, sat at my table, and sorted 6 years of paper with the concentration of a pathologist. Every time she found another vague invoice or recycled phrase, she made a low sound in her throat like a woman inventorying mold inside a wall. Nora had the useful habit of treating my emotions as real, but not sovereign. That sounds harsher than it felt. In a situation like mine, you need at least one person in the room who is not fed by your shock. She never once told me to breathe or sit or prepare myself for what she might say next. She simply kept pulling fact after fact into the light until denial had no surfaces left to stand on. Nora refused to flatter my pain. That was a gift. The world has no shortage of people willing to say, "This must be so hard," and then drift uselessly around the edges of disaster. Nora does not drift. She cuts. She printed entity charts, circled repetition in the invoices, and explained shell layering the way other people explain weather. Somewhere between her second cup of coffee and her first curse word of the morning, the whole nightmare started feeling less supernatural and more prosecutable. I needed that. Monsters are exhausting. Fraudsters can at least be traced. By the second day, Nora had a legal pad full of questions and a separate page titled leverage. I asked why that word. She said, because facts by themselves do not always stop people. Sometimes you need to know where the facts will hurt their confidence fastest. I have thought about that often since. Truth matters. Placement matters too. After 40 minutes, she looked up and said, "Daniel, this is not medical reporting. This is narrative maintenance with a billing department." You know a lie is serious when the first honest person to examine it does not start with surprise. She starts with structure. There is a dignity in sitting beside someone who knows how to investigate without turning your life into a theater of sympathy. Nora gave me that dignity. She let me be frightened, furious, ashamed, and still useful. That combination kept me moving when grief alone might have made me theatrical and therefore strategically weak. There is a dignity in sitting beside someone who knows how to investigate without turning your life into a theater of sympathy. Nora gave me that dignity. She let me be frightened, furious, ashamed, and still useful. That combination kept me moving when grief alone might have made me theatrical and therefore strategically weak. By lunchtime, Nora had given the situation its first real shape. Not mystery, not tragedy, fraud, control, isolation. Language matters because once the right nouns enter the room, shame has less territory to occupy. Nora began with public records. The private recovery program named on most of the invoices existed only on paper. No active residential license, no consistent state registration, no verifiable staff list. The address tied to the initial care site had once been a short-term executive rental outside Lancaster, and later a mailbox service in Mechanicsburg. Rowan Vale's consulting practice was real enough to charge people, and vague enough to survive scrutiny from anyone too tired to finish digging. Then Nora found Stonebrook, a restored estate outside Lidditz, held through a layered trust structure, linked to one of Rowan's shell entities, and an investment partnership where Elise's name appeared under a management clause she had somehow never mentioned to me. Public records do not care about grief. That may be their only moral advantage. A shell company is a shell company even if a widow formed it. A trust layering is still a trust layering even if a daughter is supposedly benefiting from its existence. Stonebrook's paperwork read like luxury asset management, not trauma care. Once Nora showed me the architecture, all the old invoices began to look like tickets to a performance staged miles away from whatever my daughter actually needed. Stonebrook was marketed publicly through architectural photographs and a vague wellness trust profile that sounded like heritage philanthropy for discrete families. I must have seen some version of it before and never noticed. That too stayed with me. Entire crimes can live in plain sight if they know how to borrow the aesthetic vocabulary of restoration, privilege, and calm. The place looked like the kind of property donors tour while talking about preservation. That it was also the stage on which my daughter's reality was managed for 6 years tells you everything you need to know about how class protects certain forms of harm. There is a special obscenity in seeing your child's life categorized under property administration. Occupancy rider, maintenance acknowledgement, continuity authorization. Those words made my teeth hurt. They were the language of buildings applied to a living woman whose central crime, as far as they were concerned, was having too much emotional and financial value to release honestly. Nora turned the screen and said, "Your daughter's signature is on maintenance authorizations because somebody needs her as an occupant, not because somebody is protecting her from forms." Occupant. One clean word. And suddenly all the years of euphemism looked obscene. Stonebrook's legal structure also taught me how often luxury can disguise coercion by changing what outsiders expect coercion to look like. Nobody hears estate and thinks captivity. Nobody hears wellness trust and thinks isolation. That blind spot is not accidental. Entire classes of misconduct depend on it. Stonebrook's legal structure also taught me how often luxury can disguise coercion by changing what outsiders expect coercion to look like. Nobody hears estate and thinks captivity. Nobody hears wellness trust and thinks isolation. That blind spot is not accidental. Entire classes of misconduct depend on it. Stonebrook should have been my turning point, and in a legal sense it was. In a personal sense, though, the deeper turn came when I saw how fully my money had been drafted into maintaining a life from which I was professionally excluded. While Nora traced property and money, I started looking at Elise differently. Not the woman who folded napkins neatly and remembered anniversaries. The woman behind the choreography. She had no old college friends I had ever met. No family who stayed in touch longer than Christmas phone calls. Her charitable foundation work looked impressive from a podium and strangely thin on actual detail once Nora pulled grant reports and board minutes. Enough truth to build credibility. Not enough to hold weight. There were also 2 older civil matters from Delaware and Maryland involving elder advocacy consulting, disputed care powers, and families accusing outside advisors of isolating vulnerable adults while controlling financial decisions. Elise's name never appeared as a defendant. It floated nearby in administrative roles, advisory committees, transitional support language. There's a category of person who spends years learning how institutions speak when they want to sound gentle while remaining impossible to pin down. Elise belonged to it. Committee minutes, advisory language, transitional support memoranda, stakeholder listening sessions. None of that proves guilt. But in the aftermath, it revealed her preferred habitat, rooms where moral fog can be drafted into official minutes and nobody asks who profits from the blur. After Nora showed me the civil records tied faintly to Elise's past, I started remembering conversations I had once filed under meaningless oddity. The way she asked probing questions about trust design at dinner parties, her disproportionate interest in guardianship stories in the news, the little thrill in her voice when she described families fighting over what was in someone's best interest. At the time, I heard those things as intelligence and perhaps a touch of gossip. In retrospect, they sounded like a craftsperson admiring tools she already knew how to use. Elise's history, once assembled, looked like a pattern designed by somebody smart enough never to repeat the same exact surface twice. different states, different committees, different institutions, similar shadows, vulnerable families, access to decision makers, administrative proximity to questions about capacity and best interest. It was as if she had spent years rehearsing for the role she eventually played in our house. Nora said, "She learned early that the safest place to stand in a fraud is one step to the side of the signature." That line stayed with me. One step to the side of the signature. Close enough to direct, far enough to blame the room. Elise had spent years becoming the kind of woman other people described as composed, tireless, and invaluable. I hear those words differently now. Invaluable to whom is always the first question. Tireless toward what is the second. Composition is not virtue. Sometimes it is simply rehearsed distance with better tailoring. Elise had spent years becoming the kind of woman other people described as composed, tireless, and invaluable. I hear those words differently now. Invaluable to whom is always the first question. Tireless toward what is the second. Composition is not virtue. Sometimes it is simply rehearsed distance with better tailoring. When a past is all polished front hall and no load-bearing walls, you should not call it elegant. You should call it dangerous and keep your hand off the light switch. Then Martin Hale surfaced in the paperwork, and I lost what little innocence I still had. Martin had been my operations partner for 17 years. He knew every warehouse lease, every board vote, every week month, every family death. Every year I signed checks too fast because grief makes clerical work feel indecent. Nora found Martin's private company listed as a consulting pass-through on maintenance contracts tied to Stonebrook, landscaping, security upgrades, transportation reimbursement. All bullshit, all money. When betrayal is abstract, it burns. When it arrives in spreadsheet columns, it calcifies. The first time I saw Martin's company name nested inside the Stonebrook expenses, my body reacted before my mind did. Heat, then cold, then the peculiar numbness that comes when betrayal lands somewhere already sore. Martin had been in my kitchen after Helen's funeral. He knew what I looked like on days when paperwork felt impossible. He knew exactly which parts of me had been hollowed out and left structurally useful anyway. Martin and I had been through enough ordinary male history to make his involvement feel almost impossible at first. Trade shows, warehouse expansions, Helen's funeral, a fishing trip we both hated because the mosquitoes were biblical, a dozen winters of arguing over diesel costs. Familiarity can become its own narcotic. You stop checking for moral drift because the person has been there so long it feels rude to imagine they might be mutating while you are busy elsewhere. Martin counted on exactly that. He knew I read his presence as continuity, not risk. Trust in business often rides on repetition instead of fresh evaluation. Martin knew that. He knew where my signature sat on the page, how I drank my coffee during inventory week, which board members deferred to him on operational details, and how grief had rearranged my tolerance for review. Betrayal is more efficient when it can borrow your habits. I remember whispering, Martin knew. Nora did not soften it. She said, Martin did more than know. Martin built logistical cover. That was when the story stopped being a crooked care arrangement and became a conspiracy arranged around my daughter's silence and my willingness to pay for it. For a while, I hated myself more for Martin's involvement than for Elise's, because friendship feels like a higher category of trust. I no longer think in hierarchies that way. Trust is trust. Betrayal is betrayal. The rest is just different furniture around the wound. For a while, I hated myself more for Martin's involvement than for Elise's, because friendship feels like a higher category of trust. I no longer think in hierarchies that way. Trust is trust. Betrayal is betrayal. The rest is just different furniture around the wound. I wish I could tell you betrayal from a friend felt sharper than betrayal from a spouse. It did not. It merely rounded the crime into a complete circle. I spent that night walking my kitchen in the dark, trying to understand Martin. By dawn, I found the old wound. 15 years earlier, we had gone after a state university supply contract that put Mercer Supply on a different level. Martin had built the vendor network and done half the negotiation work. I took the final meeting alone because I thought the client trusted my face more than his. We won. The press release carried only my name. I told myself at the time that I would make it right in bonuses, authority, patience. I never really did. It got worse later. Martin's wife left him the year after Helen got sick, and I was too busy trying to save my own house to notice his gambling had turned from embarrassing to dangerous. We had been standing side by side for years while entire resentments were maturing quietly under the floorboards. No conspiracy survives 6 years without older sediment underneath it. Resentment, humiliation, debt, envy, the slow corrosive tally some men keep when they cannot bear to name their own failures cleanly. I am not innocent in Martin's history. That matters. But being part of the story of a man's bitterness is not consent to become the raw material of his revenge. He knew the difference. He simply stopped caring about it. I do not offer that old contract story to excuse him, but I also refuse the easier vanity of pretending I was blameless in every earlier chapter of our relationship. I was ambitious. admired in ways he was not, and often careless about sharing light. That is all true. What is also true is that honest resentment still leaves a man with options other than helping isolate a daughter and sedate a father into administrative compliance. Martin passed those exits years before I knew he was even looking for an off-ramp. When people later asked whether I saw the signs in Martin sooner, I answered no, because that is the truth. What I saw was tiredness, occasional envy, the ordinary bitterness men drag around without ever taking to a doctor or a priest. I did not see conspiracy. Maybe because conspiracy is easier to imagine in strangers than in men who once borrowed your socket set and returned it clean. That morning, staring at an old board photo, I said, "You waited until I was tired." And the answer in my head came back immediately. Of course he did. Most revenge does not arrive hot. It arrives when the target has been softened by years, by guilt, by funerals, by paperwork, by the comforting lie that old colleagues are too familiar to become predators. I have made my peace with the fact that I cannot revisit every old business decision to see whether kindness might have diverted him from becoming what he became. That road has no end. Accountability only starts once we stop using old hurts as excuses for new machinery built to grind other people down. I have made my peace with the fact that I cannot revisit every old business decision to see whether kindness might have diverted him from becoming what he became. That road has no end. Accountability only starts once we stop using old hurts as excuses for new machinery built to grind other people down. Regret is not a legal defense. Still, I would be lying if I said old mistakes did not echo through the room after that. They did. They just never once justified what he chose to build out of them. 3 days after the document arrived, Nora drove me out to Stonebrook. We did not go in. Not yet. We parked half a mile away on a narrow service road and watched the main gates through wet branches. The estate looked less like a clinic than a resort that had learned to lower its voice. Old stone walls, winter garden glass, converted carriage house, security cameras tucked high and neat enough to hide unless you already distrusted beauty. A woman in navy scrubs came and went with groceries. A groundsman unloaded supplies. Around 4:20, a black sedan pulled in. Martin got out. At 4:36, Elise arrived. At 4:52, through the glass of the winter garden, I saw my daughter. Surveillance is a strange grief. You sit close enough to a person to see their posture, but too far to alter it. You watch a live life through glass and distance and try to understand whether what hurts most is proof of survival or proof of what survival has cost. Seeing Leah at Stonebrook did not reassure me for a second. It only made the missing years feel populated, furnished, and deliberate. Sitting in the borrowed SUV with rain beating on the windshield, I kept thinking how much money grief can spend on beauty if no one insists on ethics first. Stonebrook's drive alone could have paid for a small scholarship. The trimmed hedges, restored stone, and immaculate greenhouse glass were not incidental. They were part of the argument. Look how lovely this is. Look how gently she must be living. Look how impossible it would be for cruelty to coordinate itself under such tasteful conditions. Taste is often the final insulation between the truth and the people least willing to imagine it. Driving back from Stonebrook, I kept thinking, not she is alive, but they let me believe distance was mercy while she drank tea behind glass. Specific images do that to you. They replace abstraction with furniture, weather, and architecture. Once that happens, the lie can no longer hide inside broad, compassionate nouns. I did not say her name. I made a sound I had never heard come out of myself before. Part relief, part nausea, part grief, finally finding a live body to attach itself to. Leah was alive, standing upright, holding a ceramic mug, looking out over trimmed hedges as if the world had simply narrowed around her until she no longer expected a horizon. The drive back through wet farmland, after seeing Leah at Stonebrook, felt longer than the drive out, though the roads were the same. That is how knowledge works when it has finally crossed from suspicion into image. Distance acquires weight. The drive back through wet farmland after seeing Leah at Stonebrook felt longer than the drive out, though the roads were the same. That is how knowledge works when it has finally crossed from suspicion into image. Distance acquires weight. People later asked why I did not storm the property right then. Because love without strategy would have handed them one more story to use against us, and by then I was finally tired of paying for my own impulses. She looked thinner than she should have, but not ruined. Better than a captive, worse than a daughter. That is the closest I can come to the truth of it. She wore cream wool, her hair shorter than I remembered, one hand tucked under the other elbow the way Helen used to stand when she was trying not to show she was cold. She turned once toward the door behind her, as if listening for permission even while alone. Nora handed me binoculars. Leah's face came into focus, and so did the damage. Not bruises, not chains. Something subtler and in some ways crueler. A constant readiness to be interpreted by someone else. People imagine coercion leaves dramatic marks because dramatic marks would at least make recognition easier. Leah's real damage lived in hesitation, in the fraction of a beat before she moved, in the way she checked empty space for approval, in the unnatural neatness of a life arranged by others but described to her as recovery. Once you see that kind of control clearly, ordinary rooms become harder to trust. For days afterward, I carried that one image of Leah to bed and back out of bed again, not because it answered anything, but because it denied my old fantasy of total medical ruin. She was not gone. She was not unreachable in any natural sense. She had been positioned, held inside comfort and explanation until the very shape of permission around her life no longer looked strange from a distance. You cannot unsee that once you have seen it. The knowledge sours every elegant room built without consent. I went home and dreamed that night of Helen in the winter garden, not Leah. In the dream, Helen was cleaning fingerprints from the glass and saying nothing at all. When I woke up, I understood the dream perfectly. Some messes are too cold for speech at first. You just keep wiping until the shape of them appears. Nora said quietly, "This is not inpatient care. This is curated dependence." I could not answer. I was too busy trying not to pound on the gate until my hands came apart. That was the first time I understood physical freedom can still be a prison if every corridor out of it has been lined with lies. That image also cured me of one dangerous fantasy. I had imagined, without admitting it, that if Leah was alive, she might immediately understand everything once she saw me. The winter garden taught me otherwise. Truth required architecture too. Better architecture than theirs, but architecture all the same. That image also cured me of one dangerous fantasy. I had imagined, without admitting it, that if Leah was alive, she might immediately understand everything once she saw me. The winter garden taught me otherwise. Truth required architecture too. Better architecture than theirs, but architecture all the same. That image of Leah in the winter garden remained with me through every hearing afterward. Not because it was the worst moment, because it showed how ordinary abuse can look once comfort has been used as camouflage. We spent the next week building proof. Nora found a storage cabinet in Elisa's downtown office through a cleaning contractor who owed her a favor. Inside were banker boxes of unopened mail, Christmas cards, birthday notes, my handwriting on dozens of envelopes addressed to Leah, some slid open and resealed, some never opened at all. More than that, there were letters from Leah to me, real letters, folded, stamped, never sent. Each one marked in pencil with dates and short notes in Rowan's handwriting. Not clinically useful, increases dependency, postpone, rewrite if needed. I sat on the floor of my own office after Nora brought the first batch over and read 6 years of stolen contact. Leah wrote to tell me when snow fell at Stonebrook, when she dreamed of Helen, when she remembered the smell of the lumber yard after rain, when she hated me, when she missed me, when she tried not to do both at once. I still believe the letters were the moral center of the case. Money established motive. Shell companies established opportunity. Sedatives established intent around me. But the letters established desecration. They proved someone had stood in the middle of a father's love and a daughter's fury and edited both for profit. There are crimes the law knows how to count, and crimes only the heart can weigh. The letters belonged to both categories at once. Reading Leah's unsent letters was more intimate than any conversation I had with anyone else that year. Anger on page 3. Exhaustion on page 2. One line about Helen's yellow mixing bowls. A paragraph about how Rowan said longing is often disguised aggression. A page ripped halfway through because she no longer trusted her own tone. And underneath all of it, a terrible tenderness trying to survive without any assurance it was still wanted. That box convinced me the case was no longer about suspicion. It was about restitution for emotional theft. Leah's letters taught me something else too. Rage had kept her more intact than the supervisors realized. Even under all that management, she was still trying to name what felt wrong. Not always accurately, not always safely, but persistently. They stole contact. They never fully stole the impulse toward truth. That fact carried me through the darkest parts of the case. The line that nearly stopped my heart was this: "If you wanted me gone, you could have said it once." You didn't have to keep paying people to make the silence official. There are injuries money cannot describe. That sentence was one of them. If anyone ever asks what object from the case mattered most, I still say the letters. Not because they were dramatic, but because they were domestic. They proved the crime did not only live in trusts and sedatives and shell companies. It lived in birthdays, weather, recipes, memories, and all the ordinary traffic of affection someone decided could be intercepted and monetized. If anyone ever asks what object from the case mattered most, I still say the letters. Not because they were dramatic, but because they were domestic. They proved the crime did not only live in trusts and sedatives and shell companies. It lived in birthdays, weather, recipes, memories, and all the ordinary traffic of affection someone decided could be intercepted and monetized. If I sound reverent when I talk about paper now, that is why. Paper held the proof that love had continued on both sides even when human voices were being filtered, redirected, and priced. We could have gone to the police right then. Nora said as much. But Dana Morrow, the prosecutor Carver trusted, wanted the spine of the case to be unbreakable. If we moved too early, Elise and Rowan would call it voluntary therapeutic residence. Martin would call the money consulting. Leah, if not prepared carefully, might repeat years of planted language and hand them an argument they would use to bury the rest. So we chose the harder thing. Get me in front of Leah without Elise or Rowan controlling the room. Undo enough of the lie, face to face, that Leah could recognize the next set of facts when they came. Every instinct in me wanted rescue to happen as force. Gate opened, daughter removed, villains cornered. But coercion that has lived a long time does not end cleanly just because someone trustworthy finally appears. Leah had been taught that direct contact with me could destabilize her. The first conversation needed to be strong enough to open a door in her thinking, without becoming another overwhelming event she could later be convinced to reinterpret against herself. Dana's phrase about restoring a witness bothered me until I realized how often families in pain reach too quickly for reunion language, because reunion feels morally superior to process. But reunion without restored agency can become just another scene the manipulator later reframes. Leah needed not only to see me, she needed to feel the evidence move through her own hands in a room not curated by the people who had turned her perception into an asset. That was the real preparation, not logistics, conditions under which her own thinking could return to her and stay there. Everything about the Orchard meeting felt ethically fragile, which is another reason it worked. We were not storming a prison. We were creating conditions under which a controlled adult could encounter unfiltered evidence and choose what to do with it. Agency had to be restored inside the rescue, or the rescue would inherit too much of the old shape. Dana said, "You are not going in there to win an apology. You are going in there to restore a witness. A witness. Not a victim. Not a daughter yet. A witness." It sounded cold at the time. Later I understood it was one of the kindest choices anybody made for us. There is courage in restraint, though the world celebrates it less than force. We needed restraint because anything louder would have let the old system describe us as destabilizing. Quiet truth, introduced carefully, was the one weapon they had not budgeted for. There is courage in restraint, though the world celebrates it less than force. We needed restraint because anything louder would have let the old system describe us as destabilizing. Quiet truth, introduced carefully, was the one weapon they had not budgeted for. I agreed to the plan because I understood by then that rescue without credibility can become just another chapter in somebody else's control narrative. The chance came through routine. Leah took supervised walks in the lower orchard on Wednesdays when Rowan was in Philadelphia and Elise usually handled foundation lunches downtown. A temporary gardener on the estate payroll was one of Carver's cooperating witnesses after a wage dispute put him in the mood to be useful. He left a side gate unlatched, and a service path camera turned 5 degrees too far east. Nora and I went in just after noon. I had imagined 1,000 versions of seeing Leah again. None of them included mud on my shoes, my own pulse roaring in my ears, and the knowledge that one wrong sentence could make her run from me instead of toward me. In those first seconds in the orchard, I understood something else I had not prepared for. Reunion is not the opposite of separation. When separation has been curated expertly, reunion is its own shock. My face was proof against 6 years of explanation. No wonder the sight of me hit her like danger before it could settle into relief. I had not anticipated how much of the first meeting would be about restraint. Every cell in me wanted to close the distance, touch her face, apologize for 6 years at once, promise impossible repairs. But apology can sound suspiciously like interpretation if it arrives before the other person has reoriented. So I stood still and let the weather, the mud, and the letters do their work before I asked her for anything larger than another minute. In some ways, that was the first decent thing I had done for her since the accident. When Leah first said, "Who let you in?" I realized how complete the enclosure had been. Not because she thought I was dangerous, but because she assumed every real encounter still required authorization. Imagine needing permission structures so long they begin to substitute for reality itself. When she turned and saw me between the bare apple trees, she did not cry. She went white and said, very clearly, "Who let you in?" That was when I learned love and indoctrination can occupy the same body at the same time. She knew my face. She did not know what to do with my presence. Even now I remember the cold in the orchard more vividly than some later court dates. Cold has its own honesty. It does not interpret. It simply insists the body notice where it stands. In that sense, the orchard gave us both something Stonebrook never did. Even now I remember the cold in the orchard more vividly than some later court dates. Cold has its own honesty. It does not interpret. It simply insists the body notice where it stands. In that sense, the orchard gave us both something Stonebrook never did. I had spent years imagining what I would say first if Leah ever stood in front of me again. In reality, the first useful thing I gave her was not a speech. It was room enough to doubt what she had been told about me. I stopped 6 feet away and said the simplest thing I had. "Leah, I have been trying to get to you for 6 years." Her eyes moved over me like she was checking for damage, motive, deception. Up close, she looked older around the mouth and younger in the way prolonged control can make adults seem unfinished. She clutched her gloves in one hand so tightly her knuckles blanched. There are silences that feel respectful. This one felt mined. The 6 feet between us contained more fraud than most courtrooms see in a month. A daughter trained to see her father as the sponsor of her exile. A father trained to believe his daughter needed that exile to remain functional. We stood there with both lies still warm between us, each waiting to see whether the other would confirm the script one more time. It took letters to do what love by itself, at that moment, could not. Leah's accusation that I had paid people to make silence official contained more of our shared tragedy than any indictment ever could. She had spent years turning my absence into motive because motive hurts less than meaninglessness. If I chose distance, then at least the world remained coherent. To learn that I had been choosing contact in ways she never saw was not immediate relief for her. It was another destabilization, another proof that the map in her head had been redrawn without consent. For months afterward, I kept replaying her line about paying people to make silence official. The phrase revealed how children, even grown children, will invent dreadful motives for a parent rather than accept that the system around them may be profoundly fraudulent. Personal rejection is often easier to grasp than institutional evil. She said, "You were not trying. You paid them to manage me because it was easier than having a daughter who broke in public." I answered, "I wrote to you every week." She stared. Then she said, "I never got a single letter." People talk about a heart dropping as if it is a figure of speech. It is not. The body really can lose altitude inside itself. I do not blame Leah for believing the worst of me. To survive years of curated silence, the mind must choose a story. The tragedy was not that she chose one. The tragedy was that the people nearest her had stocked the shelf so carefully with only cruel versions. I do not blame Leah for believing the worst of me. To survive years of curated silence, the mind must choose a story. The tragedy was not that she chose one. The tragedy was that the people nearest her had stocked the shelf so carefully with only cruel versions. People want reconciliation to be instinctive. Sometimes reconciliation begins as a forensic exercise conducted with shaking hands. Nora stepped forward then and put the first stack of letters in Leah's hands. My envelopes, her envelopes, postmarks, dates, Rowan's pencil notes, Elise's filing tabs. Leah looked down, then up, then back down. She opened one letter I had written 3 winters earlier about the first snow on Front Street, and how Helen used to say silence looks different when it belongs to weather instead of pain. Her mouth trembled on the second paragraph. Then she opened one of her own, the kind she had been told had gone out, and saw Rowan's handwriting across the top, unsuitable emotional content. When Leah opened the first envelope and saw my handwriting answering a winter she had spent believing I had forgotten she existed, I watched 6 years of structure bend in her face all at once. Not break yet. Bend. People talk as if truth immediately liberates. Often it destabilizes first. The old architecture has to groan before it falls. Nora understood the pace better than I did. She did not interrupt when Leah started opening envelopes almost greedily, as if each postmark might return an entire missing season. I think that was the moment I fell a little in love with evidence as a moral force. Emotion alone could have been dismissed. Paper, when touched by the right hands at the right time, became witness without demanding performance. It let Leah discover rather than merely be told. Discovery is harder to steal back. I watched her thumb the envelopes like a woman checking whether objects were allowed to be solid. That is another hidden cost of prolonged manipulation. It does not merely alter beliefs. It alters texture, certainty, the felt reliability of things held in one's own hand. She whispered, "They said you sent money because you couldn't bear the shame of seeing me." I said, "They told me you couldn't survive contact with me." She laughed once, broken and furious. "So they sold us each the version that would keep us still." That may be the cleanest summary of the whole crime. Nora later told me she knew the moment Leah saw Rowan's pencil note that the case had turned. Not one, turned. Sometimes all a mind needs in order to stop defending a lie is one artifact too concrete to reinterpret on command. Nora later told me she knew the moment Leah saw Rowan's pencil note that the case had turned. Not one, turned. Sometimes all a mind needs in order to stop defending a lie is one artifact too concrete to reinterpret on command. Every page she touched returned a little authorship to her. I could see it happening even through the shock. We only had 11 minutes before the orchard loop ended, but sometimes 11 honest minutes can undo years of poisoned language. Leah spoke in fragments. After the crash, she had headaches, memory gaps, panic episodes, yes. Rowan medicated aggressively early and framed every objection as evidence she was not ready to direct her own care. Elise stayed close, always sympathetic, always the translator between Leah's pain and the world outside it. Every moment of anger got documented as instability. Every moment of longing for home got turned into regression. Then came the central lie. Rowan told her my business had suffered because of public fallout from the crash and that I needed distance from what he called her volatility. Elise said I agreed privately that money was the only kind of support I could sustain. Once that wound took root, every silence fed it. Her fragments came fast because controlled people often store their own reality in pieces. Medication schedules, phrases, rooms, permission pathways, consequences. What outsiders call confusion is sometimes just memory trying to escape a system that taught it to travel under false names. I listened the way I wish I had listened years earlier when specialists first started explaining my daughter back to me in borrowed language. Leah described Stonebrook in layers, and what struck me most was how little of the prison looked like a prison from inside a photograph. A tea schedule, supervised silence hours, monitored calls, session notes, approved reading lists, reconsideration exercises, guided memory frames. Anyone could glance at the program and call it support. Only someone living under it knew how every apparently therapeutic practice bent toward dependency once Rowan and Elise decided direct family reality posed a threat to their arrangement. At one point, Leah stopped mid-sentence and said, almost apologetically, "I hear them when I try to tell this straight." Miriam later explained that conditioned authority often continues narrating long after the room has changed. Knowing that did not make it less painful to hear. But it helped us wait without rushing in to fill every gap for her. Leah said, "They told me you visited once and left relieved. I had to close my eyes before I answered. I never stopped asking to see you." In that orchard, I realized captivity is often nothing more than enough false context repeated until freedom sounds unsafe. What Leah offered us in those fragments was more than testimony. It was a guide to the interior design of coercion. Not the architecture of walls, but of timing, permission, review, and shame. Once mapped, it was devastating. What Leah offered us in those fragments was more than testimony. It was a guide to the interior design of coercion. Not the architecture of walls, but of timing, permission, review, and shame. Once mapped, it was devastating. Listening to her, I understood how often institutions mistake documented control for therapeutic progress simply because the notes are neat and the family has been worn down into compliance. Before we left, Leah told us one more thing. 3 months earlier, Rowan and Elise had started pushing new documents toward her. Occupancy acknowledgements, trust participation language, care continuity authorizations. She signed some because they said, without stable legal planning, she could be transferred to a more restrictive facility if my payments changed. That was how the property transfer ended up on my desk. Somebody in their paperwork chain got lazy. She also said Martin had started attending some of the meetings, always with ledgers, always talking about sustainability, inheritance exposure, future stewardship. My stomach tightened hearing my own life translated into predator language around my daughter's chair. The most useful lies in long schemes are the lies attached to paperwork. Paper looks calmer than panic. A signature looks cleaner than fear. Every new form they put in front of Leah was not just administrative. It was rehearsal for erasure, one authorized line at a time. Once we knew that, the rest of the plan could finally be built around evidence instead of intuition. The phrase, "enough truth," stayed with me because it rejected both melodrama and false patience. Leah was not asking for comfort balloons or furious promises. She was asking for a quantity of fact capable of surviving contact with the machinery that had out-narrated us for years. Once she said that, the path ahead felt brutally clear. More records, more witnesses, more dates, less speculation. Enough truth to crush interpretation by sheer documented weight. I drove home from the orchard aware that rescue was no longer a fantasy event in the future. It had begun already, quietly, in the moment Leah asked for enough truth instead of one more soothing explanation. Everything after that was logistics in service of a moral fact already forming. As Nora pulled me back toward the service path, Leah caught my sleeve and said, "If you come back with enough truth that they cannot explain me over it. Enough truth. Not comfort, not rescue in a movie sense. Enough truth that the old system could not swallow her words again." Walking back down that service path, I understood for the first time that rescue would require patience in proportions rage always considers insulting. I hated that. It was still true. Walking back down that service path, I understood for the first time that rescue would require patience in proportions rage always considers insulting. I hated that. It was still true. Once Leah asked for enough truth instead of immediate comfort, I knew she was already moving out of their script and back toward herself. From that day on, the case moved in 2 directions at once. Publicly, nothing changed. I ate dinner with Elise, went to board meetings with Martin, and acted like the misrouted document had gone wherever misrouted documents go when nobody important notices them. Privately, Nora, Dana, and Carver built a map of 6 years so dense it began to look like a city of deliberate harm. There were fake care review notes, inflated staffing invoices, forged pharmacy reimbursement requests, shell entities moving money between Stonebrook, Rowan's consultancy, Elise's foundation work, and Martin's operations accounts. There were also recordings from Leah's room monitor system showing Rowan coaching her before supposed independent capacity assessments. From the outside, our days might have looked almost boring during that phase. Meetings, scans, phone calls, subpoenas, rehearsals. But boredom in an investigation is often just concentration with better furniture. Each recovered file, each bank movement, each script note, each intercepted message put another wall around the people who had spent years walling Leah away from the rest of us. Those weeks altered my sense of time. Daylight became for acting normal. Evenings became for evidence. Midnight became for old letters, cold coffee, and the sort of rage that wears glasses because it still has files to review before dawn. People later congratulated me for my composure. That always amused me. Composure had almost nothing to do with it. I was simply too busy to fall apart on schedule. Carver kept reminding us that cases fail when good people assume the ugliness will speak for itself. It does not. Ugliness must be indexed, authenticated, copied, preserved, and paired to dates if you want it to survive competent defense counsel. That was infuriating and deeply reassuring. The law, for all its flaws, at least distrusts drama enough to require paperwork. On one clip he said, "Remember, your father's guilt is the only stable resource in this arrangement. Do not challenge the structure unless you want it all to become clinical again." Arrangement, resource, clinical. That was how they had laundered a daughter's stolen life into business language. Every new folder on Dana's table made the old story less survivable for them. I found comfort in that accumulation. Not because I enjoy paperwork, but because paperwork had been the medium of the fraud for so long. There was justice in turning the medium against its makers. Every new folder on Dana's table made the old story less survivable for them. I found comfort in that accumulation. Not because I enjoy paperwork, but because paperwork had been the medium of the fraud for so long. There was justice in turning the medium against its makers. Some evenings I would sit in my car outside the office long after everyone had gone home and try to comprehend how many administrative decisions it takes to keep one healthy lie alive for 6 years. Dana also found something uglier, something that brought the whole scheme even closer to my body than I had understood. For 14 months, Elise had been arranging my wellness care through a concierge physician she claimed specialized in stress, sleep, and executive fatigue. The vitamins she pressed on me each morning were not vitamins. Mild sedatives. Nothing dramatic. Just enough to make memory feel thinner, concentration patchy, emotion easier to question. Rowan had notes on this too. Their next move was not subtle once Dana laid it out. They intended to argue I was slipping cognitively, put Mercer Supply under interim oversight, and consolidate Leah's trust participation into a long-term managed estate plan with Elise and Martin on the right committees. The sedative angle changed me in ways I have not fully sorted out even now. It is one thing to learn someone lied to you at a distance. It is another to discover they were also adjusting the chemistry through which you experienced your own doubt. For months after, every forgotten name and tired afternoon felt contaminated by the question of whether it had been mine or theirs. That uncertainty is its own kind of theft. The idea that Elise had been feeding me sedation under the label of care landed with a special kind of disgrace. I kept thinking of all the mornings she placed the bottle beside my plate and smiled as if routine itself were intimacy. The body remembers betrayal differently when it entered through the mouth. Coffee tasted wrong for weeks. Capsules in ordinary pharmacy bottles looked suddenly theatrical. Trust, once contaminated at breakfast, takes a long time to digest back into anything useful. I had blood work done after the sedatives were confirmed. Nothing life-threatening, the doctors said. Mild levels, intermittent exposure, enough to cloud, not enough to announce. Even their dosing strategy reflected the central intelligence of the scheme. Never enough to spark emergency, always enough to make self-trust slightly more expensive. Dana placed the documents in front of me and said, "They are not just taking from your daughter, they are preparing to convert you into a signature problem. If you want to understand greed at its most patient, study the people who do not steal once. They build a future in which you no longer count as the author of your own life." After the toxicology review, my doctor asked whether I wanted anger management support. I told him no. Anger was not the problem. Misdirected trust had been the problem. Anger was merely what honesty looked like once it caught up. After the toxicology review, my doctor asked whether I wanted anger management support. I told him no. Anger was not the problem. Misdirected trust had been the problem. Anger was merely what honesty looked like once it caught up. Nothing makes you hate a polite breakfast table more than learning it doubled as a dispensing station for your own future irrelevance. When confronted with enough paper, motive usually stops pretending to be complicated. Martin was underwater on private debt and had been moving company funds for years in amounts small enough to avoid attention, while I was grieving Helen and later paying for Leah's supposed care. Elise had found in him exactly what she needed. A man with access, resentment, and a talent for justifying theft as delayed fairness. Rowan needed steady money and a live human system complex enough to keep professionals intimidated by jargon. Leah became the center of that system. I became the fuel. Nora called it an emotional utility scam. Dana called it coercive financial control. I called it evil, which was not legally useful but was still true. By then the scheme had too many motives to fit inside one sentence, which is another sign it has matured. Greed alone can be clumsy. Greed braided with resentment, access, vanity, entitlement, and the thrill of successful manipulation becomes patient. Patient enough to look like care for 6 full years while drafting documents that assume you will never look up from your guilt long enough to read the header closely. By the time Dana finished mapping the money, I could see why the scheme had hardened instead of ending. Each year of successful isolation made the next year easier to justify internally. They had salaries, side entities, property leverage, and eventually legal planning tied to the continuation of Leah's managed existence. In other words, ending the lie would have required them to give up both money and the identities they had built around being the indispensable adults in the room. People sacrifice truth much more readily once it becomes payroll. Greed alone would have moved faster. That is one reason the scheme lasted so long. It was slowed and therefore stabilized by all the other satisfactions it delivered to the people inside it. Control for Elise, professional dominion for Rowan, financial cover, and revenge for Martin. They were not all feeding on the same hunger, which made the system more durable than any one motive could have made it by itself. At 2 a.m. one night I told Nora, I could survive them stealing money. I do not know if I can survive what they trained her to believe about me. Nora answered, then do not survive that part, undo it. That became the quiet spine under everything that followed. One lesson from the case is that people do not need to agree on love to collaborate effectively in harm. They only need overlapping self-interest. That may be a bleaker insight than some listeners want. It is also one I would rather carry than lose to sentimentality again. One lesson from the case is that people do not need to agree on love to collaborate effectively in harm. They only need overlapping self-interest. That may be a bleaker insight than some listeners want. It is also one I would rather carry than lose to sentimentality again. When you spread all of that out on a whiteboard, the scheme looked less like one monstrous act and more like a small economy. That may be the most chilling description I can honestly give it. Leah could not simply walk out of Stonebrook and testify cleanly. Years of managed dependence had left grooves in her reflexes. When authority entered a room, her body still prepared to be interpreted. So Dana brought in a trauma specialist named Miriam Sloan and built sessions that were less about law than about language. What did Rowan say when he wanted obedience? What did Elise say when she wanted shame? Which phrases meant threat? Which phrases meant fake compassion? Which words made Leah doubt her own memory fastest? There was a kind of cruelty in hearing my daughter recite the mechanics of her conditioning as if she were inventorying tools from a workshop. If Rowan said perspective, it meant disagreement would be pathologized. If Elise said stewardship, money was involved. If either of them said simplification, something permanent was being planned around her without her. Watching Leah learn to answer their phrases without surrendering to them was like watching someone rebuild muscle around an injury that had been called personality. Every small correction mattered. Not because she needed to perform strength for us, but because the case required her to speak in a room where Elise and Rowan had spent years claiming interpretive ownership over her distress. She did not need to become fearless. She needed to become untranslatable. What Miriam gave Leah was not confidence in some cheap motivational sense. She gave her distinctions. This phrase is theirs, this memory is yours, this bodily reaction is a conditioned response, this need is real, this shame was installed, this silence belongs to fear, not agreement. Watching someone reacquire distinctions after years of coercive blur is astonishing. The human mind can be taught to doubt almost everything except the relief that comes when a clean boundary is finally named. Miriam once said, "They made insight feel disloyal." I wrote that sentence down too. It explained almost everything. Leah was not only afraid of consequences. She had been trained to experience independent understanding as betrayal of the very people who supposedly kept her safe. Undoing that knot required more than evidence. It required repeated proof that clarity would not cost her love from us. Miriam asked once, "What was the most dangerous sentence they used on you?" Leah answered immediately, "We are the only people who can still interpret you correctly." That was the sentence I started hearing even when the room was empty. Miriam insisted on something else I will always respect. She told Leah that recovery did not require making herself legible to us at every moment. That freedom from compulsory clarity was itself part of the healing. After years of being interpreted, she was finally allowed not to perform her own progress on demand. Miriam insisted on something else I will always respect. She told Leah that recovery did not require making herself legible to us at every moment. That freedom from compulsory clarity was itself part of the healing. After years of being interpreted, she was finally allowed not to perform her own progress on demand. Language retraining became the hidden hero of the whole case. Without it, the truth would still have existed, but the room might have belonged to them again. The trap they set for me became the trap we set for them. Martin was already pushing the board toward a restructuring vote tied to my supposed health and long-term estate stability. Elise planned a family trust meeting at our offices with outside counsel, one shareholder representative, Rowan as Leah's care consultant, and me as the tired man expected to sign away complexity in exchange for peace. Dana decided that would be the stage. Not Stonebrook, not a hidden camera in a bedroom, a room where they believed professionalism would protect them and signatures would finish the work. Leah would appear only at the right moment. Until then, I would play the version of myself they had been preparing to exploit, distracted, emotionally spent, grateful for guidance, just blurry enough to make their confidence expand. Plans like ours always sound cleaner in conference rooms than they feel when you are the family inside them. On paper, it was elegant. Record the admissions, trigger the intervention, preserve the documents, control the exits. In my body, it felt like preparing to place my daughter back into the field of their voices for one final harvest. The only reason I agreed was that she agreed first, and more steadily than I did. I signed off on the boardroom plan because it forced the case into the exact terrain the conspirators respected most. Documents, witnesses, governance, fiduciary language, liability. Stonebrook had been their emotional theater. The conference room would be their professional grave if we got the sequence right. That mattered to me in a way I struggled to explain at first. They had hidden behind civility and institutional polish for too long. Let civility and institutional polish be the instruments that finally stripped them bare. I also understood, perhaps for the first time in my life, why certain truths must be made public in precisely the kind of room where the harm was once dignified. Private family knowledge had failed us for 6 years. Public record would have to do what private trust had not. Carver said, "Predators always talk more in rooms where they think paper has already won for them." He was right. People lie carefully when they are trying to get power. They lie carelessly when they believe they already have it. I signed the operation forms with a steadier hand than I expected. Perhaps because by then, the decision no longer felt like vengeance dressed up as justice. It felt like maintenance, necessary work on a structure that had already collapsed morally and simply needed official notice. I signed the operation forms with a steadier hand than I expected. Perhaps because by then the decision no longer felt like vengeance dressed up as justice. It felt like maintenance. Necessary work on a structure that had already collapsed morally and simply needed official notice. I hated the plan until the moment I realized there was no version of justice in which they surrendered voluntarily. People like that only stop once evidence corners the identity they were counting on to protect them. For 2 weeks, I rehearsed my own diminishment. I missed easy details in front of Elise. Asked Martin to repeat numbers I had already quoted 10 minutes earlier. Let fatigue sit visibly on my shoulders. Complained about sleep. Forgot a board packet in the car and laughed at myself in exactly the dry, embarrassed way men like me use when they still hope other people will excuse them for getting older. Elise watched with a softness that now makes me sick to remember. One morning she touched my cheek and said, "You have been carrying too much for too long. Daniel, maybe simplicity would not be a loss for once." It sounded tender. It was asset language wearing lipstick. Acting decline before the people manufacturing your decline is a particular kind of humiliation, but humiliation was a smaller price than silence. I learned how often Elise watched my hands when I reached for a pen. I noticed how Martin slowed his speech when discussing governance, already practicing ownership. Their confidence grew in proportion to the weakness they thought they were seeing. That, too, was evidence. The strange thing about performing confusion is that you begin to notice how eagerly certain people step forward to interpret it for you. Elise started finishing my thoughts before I had fully formed them. Martin began summarizing board concerns in narrower and narrower language. Rowan, once he re-entered more directly, spoke about fatigue with the proprietary calm of a man already picturing the forms he would cite later. Their impatience was almost affectionate. They wanted my decline because they had already spent it in their heads. Sometimes Elise would watch me from the kitchen doorway with what looked like concern, and what I now know was assessment. I could almost feel her counting how much sooner than planned they might push the final transfer. There is an intimacy to that kind of observation that still unsettles me. She knew my face very well. She simply used the knowledge for inventory instead of love. I answered, "Maybe you are right." She kissed my forehead like a nurse in a play no honest person would attend. The hardest part was not acting tired. I was tired. The hardest part was pretending the people draining my life were the same people I could still safely lean on. There is something grotesque about watching people become kinder to you only because they believe your resistance is fading. I noticed it in Elise's tone, in Martin's over-helpful summaries, in Rowan's pleased caution. Their tenderness increased in direct proportion to the control they thought was almost secure. There is something grotesque about watching people become kinder to you only because they believe your resistance is fading. I noticed it in Elise's tone, in Martin's over-helpful summaries, in Rowan's pleased caution. Their tenderness increased in direct proportion to the control they thought was almost secure. By the end of the second week, Elise had already started speaking of my future, as if I were listening from a slight distance. That is another clue, by the way. The people preparing to replace your voice often practice the grammar of your disappearance before you notice the sentence changing. Leah did the harder work. She stayed at a safe apartment arranged through Miriam and learned how to answer control without stepping back into it. The first time Dana played Rowan's calm, manipulative voice in rehearsal, Leah folded inward before the second sentence finished. By the sixth session, she could look up and say, "That is interpretation, not fact." It sounds small. It is not. Reclaiming a sentence after years of filtered reality is like teaching your own lungs they are allowed to breathe before permission arrives. She also read every letter, mine, hers, all 6 years of stolen contact. Some sessions ended in anger, some in grief, some in the kind of exhausted silence that comes when your past keeps splitting into what happened and what was described to you. Recovery was not linear for Leah, because nothing honest ever is after prolonged coercion. Some sessions left her fierce. Others left her convinced for 20 minutes at a time that maybe Rowan had been partly right about her fragility. Miriam treated those reversals not as failure, but as proof of how thoroughly the manipulation had colonized her ordinary self-talk. Naming that helped. So did rage. Rage, used well, is a very clean solvent. There were sessions when Leah could barely say Martin's name without sounding as if she had bitten metal. Not because he had been central emotionally, but because he represented the merger of our two worlds. The place where family deception and financial opportunism finally shook hands. Learning to speak about him without spinning off into every secondary wound was part of the work. Trauma does not organize itself for trial. Humans have to do that, painfully, one thread at a time. The day Leah first delivered one of her new answers without any visible apology afterward, Miriam and Dana did not clap or turn the moment into therapy theater. They just nodded and moved on to the next scenario. That restraint mattered. It treated her self-recovery as normal work rather than miracle. After 6 years of being handled, normal work was exactly the kind of respect she needed. Once she looked at me over a stack of envelopes and said, "They did not only steal time, they replaced the meaning of time." I wrote that down afterward because I knew I would need the sentence later. She was already becoming more herself than their system had anticipated. That was our real leverage. She still faltered sometimes over words like safety, structure, and support. Not because the concepts were bad, but because the words had been used against her so often. Language can be bruised. It heals too, though more slowly than people expect. She still faltered sometimes over words like safety, structure, and support. Not because the concepts were bad, but because the words had been used against her so often. Language can be bruised. It heals too, though more slowly than people expect. Watching that change in Leah was one of the few places in the story where hope felt earned rather than borrowed. The meeting was scheduled for a Friday at 10 in the morning in the large conference room overlooking the loading yard. Rain on the glass, long walnut table, legal folders set at each seat, coffee arranged on a sideboard as if this were one more administrative inconvenience we could finesse into civility. Martin arrived first, with the controlled energy of a man who had practiced relief in the mirror. Rowan came next, expensive coat, careful eyes, carrying Leah's supposed care summary like scripture. Elise entered last and touched my shoulder on the way to her chair. Outside the room, plainclothes officers waited one floor below. Dana and Carver monitored live audio through a recording device disguised as my pen and a second unit inside a leather folio already sitting in the center of the table. I had sat at that conference table for acquisitions, layoffs, holiday bonuses, vendor fights, and one deeply stupid discussion about ergonomic stools. Never once had I imagined I would use the room to document the dismantling of my own family. That may be why the setting mattered so much. They had mistaken institutional polish for immunity. They thought oak and legal pads would make their version of history look like policy. Sitting down at that table, I noticed absurd details, because the mind does that under strain. A water ring near Martin's folder, the smudge of blue ink on Rowan's cuff, the little nick in the walnut veneer where a chair must have hit years ago. People sometimes think terror makes the world blurry. Often it does the opposite. It sharpens nonsense and essentials equally until your nervous system has to choose, second by second, which category a thing belongs in. I remember wondering, absurdly, whether the cleaning crew had polished the table that morning. It shone too evenly. I kept thinking how much effort goes into maintaining surfaces in places where powerful people expect their lives to look organized. It seemed almost fitting that our whole family disaster would culminate on wood no one wanted to scratch. Elise leaned close and murmured, "Once this is done, things really can become gentler for all of us." I said, "That sounds nice," and let my hand shake just enough for her to notice. Predators adore gratitude. Even fake gratitude can blind them if it arrives at the moment they think they are about to win. I wish I could tell you my heart pounded heroically. Mostly it felt heavy. Heroism is another one of those cheap, clean narratives. Real confrontations often begin under a weight you carry anyway because there is no route around it anymore. I wish I could tell you my heart pounded heroically. Mostly it felt heavy. Heroism is another one of those cheap, clean narratives. Real confrontations often begin under a weight you carry anyway because there is no route around it anymore. The room smelled faintly of coffee and rain and polished wood. By noon it would smell like fear, though guilty people almost never realize that until after the recording has already been transcribed. Martin opened with structure, interim authority, simplified oversight, legacy protection, temporary operational consolidation, Leah's long-term care stabilization. My health, my rest, my burden, my years, every line polished, every theft wrapped in concern. Rowan supported him with clinical language about decisional fatigue and emotional strain. Elise's contribution was softer and in some ways more grotesque because she was better at sounding loving while inventorying what I was about to lose. The outside counsel, a pale man with expensive cufflinks and the moral alertness of damp carpet, asked only whether all family stakeholders were represented appropriately. Martin smiled and said, "Given Leah's current reliance on therapeutic structure, this is the cleanest path forward." Every phrase Martin used was engineered to sound temporary while creating permanence underneath it. Interim, transitional, stabilizing, simplified. Those words should come with warning labels. They are the favorite tools of people who want irreversible control but understand that honest language would make the theft look rude. Rowan's jargon did the same work on the medical side. Between them, they had built a bilingual system of manipulation, finance for the board, therapy for the family. When Martin spoke of simplifying my future, I saw all at once the years of conditioning that had made such a sentence plausible. Aging man, dead wife, isolated daughter, trusted new spouse, specialist on retainer, partner with access, bored fatigued by uncertainty. Any one of those facts could have been harmless in another story. Together they formed the exact ecology his scheme needed. It still amazes me how often crime depends less on genius than on waiting for enough ordinary sorrows to line up. The shareholder representative asked only 3 questions the whole morning, which tells you something about how thoroughly financial etiquette can anesthetize a room. Had the plan progressed 1 month further, he might have signed off on my own diminishment as prudent stewardship and gone back to lunch feeling responsible. Institutions rarely need villains at every seat. Most seats can be filled by people willing to mistake tone for legitimacy. I looked down at the papers and asked, "So if I sign this, who speaks for Leah when I no longer can?" Rowan answered before anyone else. The people already carrying that responsibility with consistency. He really believed language could wash the blood off anything. Martin loved the word stewardship that morning. He said it twice before 10:10. By the second use, I almost smiled. Whenever thieves get close to ownership, they start borrowing grandparent words to bless their appetite. Martin loved the word stewardship that morning. He said it twice before 10:10. By the second use, I almost smiled. Whenever thieves get close to ownership, they start borrowing grandparent words to bless their appetite. I let them build their own ladder. All I had to do was stop offering them my shoulder as an extra rung. The first break in their confidence came when I did not sign immediately. Instead, I asked for clarification on one paragraph involving residential continuity and beneficiary restraint. Martin began explaining too fast. Rowan stepped in to slow him down. Elise reached for my hand as if touch could close thought back up again. I let the silence lengthen until it started making them uncomfortable. Then I asked the question Dana had told me to save for the right temperature. Why does a daughter who supposedly cannot bear direct family contact need her signature on a property occupancy rider dated 12 days ago? Silence is underrated in rooms full of manipulators. They rely on pace, explanation piled onto explanation before anyone can isolate the sentence that gives the game away. Once I stopped filling the pauses for them, they had to begin filling them themselves. And guilty people are almost always more incriminating when left to manage their own discomfort aloud. The occupancy rider question mattered not only because it was specific, but because it forced the conspiracy to bridge 2 worlds at once, the therapeutic fiction and the property reality. They had been keeping those languages mostly separate, one for me and Leah, one for themselves. Once asked to explain both inside the same sentence, they began showing the seams. That is another lesson I learned too late. If you want to break a sophisticated lie, make it translate itself across departments. My pulse slowed, strangely, once the first clear question landed. Fear often spikes before confrontation and settles during it if the truth is finally being allowed to do mechanical work. The room became an engine. Question, pause, answer, contradiction, another question. For a businessman, perhaps it made sense that my deepest relief arrived not in embrace but in sequence. Martin went still. Elise's eyes flashed once toward Rowan. Rowan answered, "Therapeutic autonomy can coexist with carefully managed distance." I said, "Interesting, because I have the impression some distances were managed more carefully than the therapy. Once people used to controlling a room, sense a line moving under their feet, they do what all bad actors do. They start explaining what no one innocent would need to explain." Looking back, that was the first minute in years when I felt respected by their fear. Fear is not a noble form of respect, but at least it acknowledges reality. For too long, they had only relied on my predictability. Looking back, that was the first minute in years when I felt respected by their fear. Fear is not a noble form of respect, but at least it acknowledges reality. For too long, they had only relied on my predictability. That question about the occupancy rider was the first time in years I felt their confidence actually turn and look at me instead of through me. Rowan recovered first. He said Leah had shown encouraging administrative capacity in recent months, and that small supervised decisions supported recovery. Martin added that the Stonebrook arrangement had required flexible documentation. Elise squeezed my wrist and spoke in the voice she used when she wanted to sound bruised by my confusion. "Daniel, this is exactly why we have been trying to simplify things before stress turns curiosity into distress." Curiosity into distress. There it was again, the old trick. Transform questions into symptoms and symptoms into justification. Elise's answer about letting Leah live the version of her life she could survive still angers me because it reveals the moral vanity at the center of so many controlling people. They do not think they are merely exploiting. They think they are authoring reality on someone else's behalf and should be admired for the endurance it takes. Control becomes compassion in their own memory long before it becomes a charge sheet in ours. Elise's hand on my wrist was the last private weapon she still had in that room. Touch had always been part of her method. Calming touch, steering touch, grateful touch. In that moment, it felt like a final administrative gesture, as if she still believed my body could be persuaded back into usefulness by a little practiced intimacy. I let her hold my wrist for exactly 2 seconds before moving my hand away. It was a small motion. In my memory, it still feels like an entire era ending. To this day, I can still hear the tiny change in Elise's voice when she moved from persuading me to resenting me. That shift is worth listening for in life generally. The instant someone stops trying to earn your trust and starts punishing you for withholding it is often the instant their real position becomes audible. I looked at her and asked, very quietly, "Did you ever intend to let my daughter tell her own story again?" Nobody answered. Not immediately. Martin stared at the contract. Rowan arranged his face into professionalism. Elise inhaled through her nose and said, "We intended to let her live the version of her life she could survive." That sentence was a confession pretending to be mercy. If there is one tone I hope never to hear again, it is the one Elise used when she said curiosity into distress. That tone belongs in museums under a plaque titled Administrative Cruelty, Late Career, Mixed Media. If there is one tone I hope never to hear again, it is the one Elise used when she said curiosity into distress. That tone belongs in museums under a plaque titled Administrative Cruelty, Late Career, Mixed Media. Every answer they gave after that made one thing clearer. They had confused endurance with permission for so long that my refusal felt to them like bad manners. I let the silence open wider. Outside, rain hit the windows in soft bursts. Then I said, "And what version was I living?" Martin shifted, annoyed now. He had expected signatures, not philosophy. Rowan said, "You were supporting a painful but necessary therapeutic boundary." I asked, "With $40,000 every January and enough supplemental payments to buy a second life for the people supervising it?" Martin's face changed at that. Numbers make guilty men defensive faster than morality does. The money question always sharpened Martin because he understood numbers better than feelings and therefore felt safer fighting there. But financial predators often reveal their deeper contempt precisely when they think they are being practical. To him, my daughter's life had become an expensive line item requiring management discipline. To Rowan, it had become a durable case. To Elise, it had become a place to stand while directing all of us from better angles. By then I could hear Martin's irritation rising whenever I used plain words like money, daughter, or speaking for herself. Men who hide inside systems prefer abstractions because abstractions allow harm to remain managerial. Once you say my daughter instead of beneficiary, once you say stole instead of consolidated, once you say lied instead of misaligned expectations, the room starts refusing them the anesthetic they built it for. Martin's phrase about years we could not afford to keep explaining to you has been quoted often in articles about the case. Fair enough. It deserves to live outside him. It captured the whole economy. Explanation cost them time. Time cost them money. Therefore, my right to know had become, in their minds, an operational liability. He snapped, "You are making this sound uglier than it was." I said, "Then make it sound accurate." He answered before thinking, "Accurate is that the arrangement cost money, discipline, and years we could not afford to keep explaining to you." Arrangement. Years. Cost. He was so close to the truth he could smell it and still thought polish would save him. Numbers stripped a lot of romance from the conspiracy. Good. Romance is a terrible lens for recurring harm. Recurring harm deserves accounting first, and poetry only after judgment has done its job. Numbers stripped a lot of romance from the conspiracy. Good. Romance is a terrible lens for recurring harm. Recurring harm deserves accounting first, and poetry only after judgment has done its job. I had been paying for the structure. Now the structure was starting to describe itself. That was when Dana gave the signal through my earpiece. One more push. So I asked the one question none of them had ever expected to hear from me in that room. Was Leah ever the one asking for this distance? Or did you decide distance paid better? Elise let go of my hand so abruptly I felt cold where her fingers had been. She had stopped acting wounded and started acting irritated. The mask never actually disappears all at once. It just tires. There is a point in every deception where people stop denying and begin rationalizing. That is the real threshold. Innocence says impossible. Guilt says complicated. By the time Elise was talking about the labor of management and Rowan was describing containment, they had already stepped onto the far side of that threshold without noticing the floor had changed beneath them. Elise's line about management required no legal training to understand. It was contempt distilled. She had spent years calling it care because care opened bank accounts and silenced objections. But in that room, under board lights and live recording, she briefly forgot which version of herself still paid. The one that remained was the one we needed the world to hear. When people ask if I felt triumphant in those minutes, the answer is no. I felt cold and exact. There is a kind of mercy in exactness. It does not heal, but it prevents the wound from being narrated one last time by the people who caused it. She said, "Do you know what 6 years of managing her actually took, Daniel? The panic, the rewrites, the dependency, the outbursts, the endless need to shape every contact so she did not collapse into the same loops. You paid because money was the only clean contribution you had left to make. There. Not concern. Contempt. The truth always speaks faster once it gets tired of maintaining posture. The exact instant they lost remains debatable in legal terms. In my own mind, it was the moment Elise stopped saying what was best for Leah and started saying what was easiest to manage. Control always gives itself away eventually by speaking in its own favorite verb. The exact instant they lost remains debatable in legal terms. In my own mind, it was the moment Elise stopped saying what was best for Leah and started saying what was easiest to manage. Control always gives itself away eventually by speaking in its own favorite verb. Once contempt outranks caution, truth begins leaking through the seams, no matter how expensive the speakers in the room might be. The door opened then, not dramatically, just once, and Leah walked in carrying a banker box full of letters. Every head at the table turned. Martin actually stood up halfway without meaning to. Rowan went pale in a way that no licensed professional ever should in a room full of witnesses. Elise did not move for one full second. That 1 second told me more than years of marriage ever had. Leah looked thinner than before the crash and stronger than she had looked at Stonebrook. There is a difference. Strength is not always the opposite of damage. Sometimes it is damage that has finally chosen a direction. Leah entering that room did more than surprise them. It shattered their working geometry. For 6 years, they had controlled her through distance, sequence, and mediated context. Suddenly, she was present in their polished arena, holding the one category of evidence they could never fully abstract. Human correspondence, human time, human intent. You cannot explain away a banker's box full of stolen love without sounding exactly like what you are. The banker box did something else I did not anticipate. It returned chronology to Leah's own body. Every recovered letter was a day restored to sequence. March, then June, then Christmas, then another birthday, then spring again. Not a clean repair, never that, but a visible rebuttal to the timeless fog Rowan had sold as therapeutic protection. The box said, "You were here, your father was here, the silence was manufactured, and the years can still be counted." Leah's voice in that room carried something it had not yet carried in the orchard. Witness authority. The difference matters. In the orchard we were undoing a lie. In the boardroom she was presenting the remains. Those are not the same posture. The first asks whether reality can be trusted again. The second demands that reality be entered into the record and obeyed. She set the box on the table and said, "If anybody is going to discuss my stability, my care, my money, or my future, then you can do it while looking at the letters you kept from me and the letters you kept from my father." I had dreamed of reunions. I had not dreamed of Pride arriving in a conference room carrying evidence. It turns out Pride has a sound too. cardboard on polished wood. Final. I had feared Leah might shake when she entered. Instead, the letters shook slightly in the box because cardboard does that under weight, and the slightness of it made the whole entrance feel truer than any theatrical firmness would have done. I had feared Leah might shake when she entered. Instead, the letters shook slightly in the box because cardboard does that under weight, and the slightness of it made the whole entrance feel truer than any theatrical firmness would have done. I will never forget Martin's face. Not because it was dramatic, but because it held the exact look of a man realizing the person he had budgeted as absent had arrived carrying her own archive. Everything after that moved with terrifying clarity. Leah pulled out 3 letters of her own, all marked by Rowan's pencil. 1 letter where she begged me to visit. 1 where she said she hated me because Elise told her I had chosen silence. 1 where she wrote she no longer knew whether her memories belonged to her or to whoever reviewed them afterward. Then she laid down the property transfer, the occupancy rider, and the power of attorney draft Dana had already authenticated. Rowan tried to step back into calm. He said, "Leah, this confrontation is not clinically advisable." She answered, "You charged 6 years of invoices to teach me not to trust my own language. So let me make this simple. You lied, Elise lied, Martin profited. Tell the room why." What impressed me most in that moment was not Leah's anger, though she had plenty. It was her restraint. She did not waste breath on naming them monsters. She forced them to narrate procedure. That is where institutional harm sounds worst. Not in melodrama, but in logistics. What did you decide? When did you decide it? How was it justified? Who billed for it? Who signed? Who benefited? She made them speak in their own native language until it condemned them. In another genre of story, this is where someone shouts until the villain blurts out the whole scheme in one juicy paragraph. Real life is meaner and more bureaucratic. What we got instead was better. Piece by piece, under the pressure of increasingly precise questions, they revealed the structure themselves. Containment, sustainability, management, stability, resource, arrangement. Each word was a nail. By the end, they had built their own crate. One of the jurors later wrote Leah a note through the court saying the reason he believed every word she said was because she never seemed interested in making herself look nobler than she had been. She admitted confusion, dependence, shame, and grief while still naming what was done to her. That kind of testimony is devastating precisely because it refuses the false cleanliness people expect from victims. Martin made the mistake first, because your father would have ruined the structure if he had gotten sentimental and pulled you out too early. Leah said, "Too early for what?" And Martin, angry now, answered, "For the transition to become sustainable." Sustainable. That was the word they used when crime had lived long enough to become budgeting. By then, even the coffee on the sideboard looked accusatory to me, as if ordinary office hospitality had finally realized whose voices it had been serving for all those years without permission. By then, even the coffee on the sideboard looked accusatory to me, as if ordinary office hospitality had finally realized whose voices it had been serving for all those years without permission. Leah did not win that room with volume. She won it by forcing sequence back into a story built on emotional haze. Rowan tried to rescue the situation by claiming therapeutic necessity, but Leah kept pressing. She had rehearsed exactly this. Every time he inflated his language, she cut it back to bone. Did I ever ask not to see my father? Did you ever tell me he wrote? Did you tell him I wrote? Did you link my housing to his money? Did you use my signatures to justify your legal planning? Each answer got smaller. Each evasion sounded more like an admission than the one before it. Then Elise lost patience entirely. Maybe she was tired. Maybe seeing Leah upright in that room enraged her because the performance of fragility no longer belonged to them. Elise's honesty, once it finally surfaced, had the texture of annoyance, not revelation. That fit. Predatory control is rarely theatrical from the inside. Mostly it is tedious work done by people who feel underappreciated for how efficiently they have rearranged other lives to suit themselves. Hearing her talk about me as useful and Leah as manageable clarified something I needed clarified. We had never been loved badly. We had been used fluently. The room was full of expensive paper, but the cheapest thing in it by then was their moral vocabulary. Elise's irritation, Rowan's clinical defensiveness, Martin's financial impatience. None of it carried grace once specific evidence sat in front of them. It all shrank. That may be another reason I remember the moment with such strange calm. Watching manipulative people become ordinary is ugly, but it is also deeply clarifying. Elise's line about my being useful at a distance was the sentence that returned to me most often in the early aftermath. Not because it was the cruelest, because it was the simplest. Complexity had shielded them for years. Simplicity finally destroyed them. Useful at a distance, managed at a distance. Profitable at a distance. There was the whole design in plain speech at last. She said, "Fine. You want honesty? Honesty is that your father was useful at a distance and impossible up close. Honesty is that you were easier to manage when you believed he had stepped away. Honesty is that care would have collapsed the minute either of you stopped accepting the version that paid for itself. You can spend years waiting for villains to sound grand. Mostly they sound inconvenienced. Rowan's face when Leah refused to let him interpret her in the room is one I will never forget. It was not just fear of exposure, it was professional insult. He genuinely believed the right to narrate her had become his by repetition. Rowan's face when Leah refused to let him interpret her in the room is one I will never forget. It was not just fear of exposure, it was professional insult. He genuinely believed the right to narrate her had become his by repetition. That is another thing I learned too late. Abusers hate being made specific. Specificity is where their grandeur goes to die. Dana stepped in at exactly that moment with Carver and 2 officers behind her. The outside counsel started talking about privilege until Carver told him to sit down unless he wanted to misunderstand the next 5 minutes from a holding room. Martin looked less shocked than offended. Rowan looked like a man measuring how much of his education he could still hide behind. Elise looked at me, and for the first time since I had known her, she did not bother pretending love had ever been part of her work. Dana laid out the charges as calmly as if she were reading weather: fraud, coercive control, financial exploitation, interference with communications, falsified care documentation, conspiracy. Additional counts pending depending on what digital recovery produced from Stonebrook and Rowan's servers. By the time Dana and Carver entered, the room no longer belonged to the conspirators, even though their folders still lay open. Ownership had shifted the moment the hidden logic of the documents became speakable out loud. Handcuffs only confirmed what language had already betrayed. That is why I say there is no catharsis in the arrest itself. The real change happened 1 minute earlier, when their version stopped being the version that organized the room. After Dana identified herself and the officers moved, I felt no urge to say much. Television teaches people to savor confrontation. I found I had almost no appetite for that. The recordings would speak. The documents would speak. Leah had already spoken. By then, my job was simply to remain standing in a room where my family had been translated for profit and then slowly translated back into truth. If I have any lingering gratitude toward institutional procedure, it is for what happened right there. Nobody let the room blur back into private distress. Dana named roles, officers moved, documents were sealed, statements were preserved. The machinery that had once seemed so vulnerable to manipulation now, briefly, protected us by refusing to be sentimental. Elise said, "You really would destroy everything just to feel like a father again." I answered, "No. I am destroying what you built because you turned fatherhood into your business model." There is no catharsis in handcuffs, only confirmation. When Dana read the charges, I felt less like a man avenged than a father finally hearing the room say out loud what his instincts had been denied permission to claim for years. Naming is its own form of oxygen. When Dana read the charges, I felt less like a man avenged than a father finally hearing the room say out loud what his instincts had been denied permission to claim for years. Naming is its own form of oxygen. By then, even without the officers, the moral authority of the room had already deserted them. The rest was procedure catching up to fact. Before they took Martin downstairs, he asked to speak with me privately in the side office. Dana allowed 3 minutes with the door open and an officer in view. Martin sat in a visitor chair that had probably held sales reps and warehouse managers for years, and suddenly looked small enough to lose inside it. Betrayal always seems larger while it is happening than after it has been named. He did not start with apology. Men like Martin almost never do. He started with history, the contract I took credit for, the years he told himself I would make him whole without forcing him to ask, the gambling, the debt, the humiliation of needing help from a man he already believed had stolen one version of his future. Then Elise found him through a governance seminar and recognized a grievance with accounting access. Martin wanted understanding more than forgiveness, which is typical of men who have spent years making moral trades with themselves. They do not really expect absolution. They want their ruin to be interpreted as the tragic overflow of some earlier wound rather than the sum of choices repeated over time. I could grant him context. I would not grant him tragedy. What he helped build was too deliberate for that mercy. His explanation about temporary plans becoming permanent through convenience would have sounded almost philosophical if it had not involved my daughter as the living medium. That is one of the ugliest realities about long-running harm. What begins as an exception very quickly develops an infrastructure and then a self-interested defense. Martin wanted me to believe the crime had grown accidentally. But accidents do not hold board meetings, create shell entities, and sedate widowers into smoother signatures. As he spoke, I kept noticing how old his hands looked. Not a metaphor, just old. Veins up, knuckles dry, wedding ring gone, little scar near the thumb from a warehouse blade years back. It struck me that whole lives can curdle without becoming cinematic. A man does not need to transform into something visibly monstrous to help destroy a family. He only needs enough grievance and enough chances to call his appetite practicality. He said at first it was just supposed to be temporary, a year maybe, enough to stabilize her, stabilize you, stabilize me. Then the money kept moving and nobody asked the right questions. I said no. The right questions were asked. You all learned how to answer them in a way that bought more time. That was the closest thing he got to hearing the truth from me before prison took over the rest. I left that side office with no answer to the old wound except this. Unresolved envy matures badly in the dark and becomes especially dangerous once it finds a ledger. I suppose that is warning enough for one lifetime. I left that side office with no answer to the old wound except this. Unresolved envy matures badly in the dark and becomes especially dangerous once it finds a ledger. I suppose that is warning enough for one lifetime. When the officer finally stood and told Martin his time was up, I felt less satisfaction than exhaustion. Some betrayals end not with closure, but with the simple relief of no longer having to guess whether they were real. The first month after the arrests was administration and wreckage. Leah moved into a furnished apartment Miriam recommended because she said my house, however loving, might feel too charged too fast. She was right. Love can overwhelm almost as badly as control when a nervous system has been taught to expect a price tag under every intimacy. We met for breakfast, for walks, for letter reading, for the slow, ungainly work of becoming ordinary to each other again. Some days, she talked easily about childhood and plants and Helen's music room. Some days, one scent or phrase shut her down. If I said, take your time too quickly, she heard Rowan. If I asked, are you okay too often, she heard Elise reviewing tone. So I learned a new discipline, be present without translating her. Reconnection after coercion has an embarrassing amount to do with ordinary repetition. Breakfast menus, walk routes, plant stores, small errands. Learning what silence means now, as opposed to what silence meant then. Grand gestures belong to people who think trauma is cured by cinema. Our actual healing happened through coffee cups, weather, pauses, and the gradual evidence that neither of us would again outsource the meaning of the other's quiet. One of the first normal things Leah and I did together was shop for groceries. It should not feel sacred to compare olive oil brands with your own child, but after 6 years of managed contact, ordinary choice started looking almost holy. She bought peaches, basil, coffee too expensive for my tastes, and 3 kinds of tea she admitted she did not actually like but wanted the freedom to dislike for herself. We both cried in the car afterward and then laughed because crying in parking lots had become somehow our family tradition. The breakfasts helped because they were bounded. 1 meal, 1 table. No declarations about forever. Trauma often needs bounded things more than enormous promises. Leah could leave when she wanted. I could ask once and stop. We were learning that closeness does not have to function like surveillance or proof. Sometimes it can just be eggs, weather, and whether the basil on her windowsill looked too thirsty. Once over coffee, she said, I don't need you to narrate me anymore. I just need you to stay. I told her, staying I can do. I wish more fathers were taught that staying quiet is not the same as stepping away. We eventually developed a ritual neither of us planned. After every hard conversation, one of us would name one ordinary thing for the next week. Plant nursery Saturday, soup on Tuesday, hardware store Thursday. Reality, we learned, returns best in small scheduled portions. We eventually developed a ritual neither of us planned. After every hard conversation, one of us would name one ordinary thing for the next week. Plant nursery Saturday, soup on Tuesday, hardware store Thursday. Reality, we learned, returns best in small scheduled portions. There is no shortcut through that kind of rebuilding, only repetition, honesty, and the humility to let healing look inefficient. The company survived, though not elegantly. Interim auditors found enough of Martin's diversions to make every board member look older in a single meeting. I testified. So did Nora. So did the courier from the title company who never understood how close he came to changing or ending multiple lives by ringing the wrong bell and carrying the right envelope. Rowan's files produced more than we expected. Template scripts for family distancing, coached language for capacity review, intake notes rating clients by available resources, and relational leverage. One spreadsheet column was titled Sustainability Drivers. Under Leah's case, it listed paternal guilt, widowhood history, business liquidity, emotional compliance via spouse. I printed that page and kept it in a locked drawer because sometimes evil is clearest when it stops writing in paragraphs. The spreadsheet titled Sustainability Drivers remains one of the most frightening documents I have ever seen because it proved how fully they had translated our family into inputs. Widowhood history, liquidity, emotional compliance. That is what predators with training do. They reduce the sacred and the messy to variables, then pretend the variables justify whatever they optimize for next. Audits have their own emotional weather. Hours of fluorescent light, spreadsheets, interviews, document imaging, chain of custody conversations, and the constant rude lesson that even intimate betrayal eventually has to be entered into evidence through file names. Still, I grew grateful for that work. It stripped the case of drama and left it with weight. Weight is what finally keeps people like Rowan and Elise from floating back into respectable rooms under slightly different titles. During the audits, I learned a phrase from one investigator that I wish were taught in every family dealing with opaque care arrangements. Follow the nouns that create dependence and the verbs that move money. In our case, the nouns were stability, recovery, capacity, stewardship. The verbs were transfer, manage, continue, supervise, postpone. Together, they told the whole story even before the witness statements caught up. Dana, after reading it, said, "They industrialized intimacy. I had no improvement to offer. Some crimes sound too abstract until you see them reduced to headings and formulas. Then they become unbearable in an entirely different way." The audits also exposed how many minor professionals had enabled the system through laziness rather than malice. Clerks who never checked, consultants who signed summaries they did not read, bored people who nodded along because the tone sounded responsible. That was its own bitter lesson. Evil appreciates assistance from the merely inattentive. The audits also exposed how many minor professionals had enabled the system through laziness rather than malice. Clerks who never checked, consultants who signed summaries they did not read, bored people who nodded along because the tone sounded responsible. That was its own bitter lesson. Evil appreciates assistance from the merely inattentive. If I sound clinical now, it is because rage eventually gets tired and facts remain. Facts, when properly arranged, can be a form of mercy. The trial began 9 months later. Public attention helped more than I expected and less than television would suggest. Reporters wanted monsters, motives, and spectacle. Real proceedings are slower, more paper, more dates, more objections, less thunder. But the evidence held. Leah's letters, my letters, the invoices, the sedatives, the fake care language, the shell companies, the occupancy records, the recordings from the conference room, the monitor clips from Stonebrook, the power of attorney drafts, the witness from the payroll side gate, the gardener, the title clerk, Martin's own emails about keeping the structure stable until transfer. Rowan tried to argue therapeutic innovation, misunderstood by conventional families. Elise tried to present herself as a wife trapped between a fragile daughter and a collapsing husband. Martin tried to sound like a compromised subordinate who never intended permanence. None of it survived contact with dates. Trials disappoint people who want emotionally satisfying symmetry. Real ones are repetitive, procedural, slow, and often deeply ugly in their precision. Yet there is dignity in that slowness too. Every date matters. Every exhibit number matters. Every recovered sentence matters. After 6 years of manipulated context, it was almost holy to watch plain chronology finally outrank performance. On the third day of testimony, Rowan actually tried to suggest that my letters had been withheld in part because they contained emotional dependency cues. Dana asked him to define dependency cue under oath without using any word already present in standard clinical manuals. He could not do it. Watching bad jargon collapse in public was one of the few pleasures the process offered. Not joy exactly, more like the sound of rotten framing giving way when finally asked to hold real load. The courtroom also forced me to hear our story stripped of mood. Exhibit 42, letter batch. Exhibit 87, sedation log. Exhibit 103, occupancy authorization. It was almost offensive at first, hearing intimate harm reduced to numbering. Later I understood the dignity in it. Numbers cannot be charmed. They do not blush when a defendant sounds gracious. They just hold sequence until judgment arrives. The sentence that buried them came from Leah on the stand. She said, "They did not take care of me. They took over the meaning of my life and rented it back to me one condition at a time." The courtroom went so quiet after that, even the judge took a breath before speaking. I sat through the trial with a notebook because if I did not write, I felt as though the room might slide back into abstraction. Dates, phrases, witness order, the shape of Martin's shoulders when the shell entities were explained. Writing kept my body from drifting. Perhaps it also honored Helen. She always said music teachers survive chaos by marking time wherever they can find it. I sat through the trial with a notebook because if I did not write, I felt as though the room might slide back into abstraction. Dates, phrases, witness order, the shape of Martin's shoulders when the shell entities were explained. Writing kept my body from drifting. Perhaps it also honored Helen. She always said music teachers survive chaos by marking time wherever they can find it. The law did what it could. It named, counted, and punished. Those are not small things. They are simply not the whole of repair. When sentencing came, nobody cried except one juror's wife in the back row and a junior associate who had clearly not understood what kind of legal career she had entered. Rowan got 14 years and the loss of every license, certification, and advisory status he had ever weaponized. Martin got 11 for conspiracy, fraud, and financial diversion, with restitution attached like an extra humiliation he had more than earned. Elise received the heaviest sentence, 17 years plus civil exposure that took almost everything she had hidden through layered entities and polite committee work. The judge called the case a sustained privatization of coercion under the language of care. I wrote the phrase down because it was terrible and exact. The sentences were substantial, but imprisonment was only part of what mattered. Credentials vanished, accounts froze, board memberships ended, speaking invitations evaporated, reputations stopped functioning as laundering devices. A whole network of deference they had relied on went dark at once. If revenge has any honorable form, perhaps it is this. Not ruin for its own sake, but the permanent removal of the tools someone used to civilize their cruelty. After sentencing, reporters wanted statements about closure. I avoided them. Closure is a word people use when they want pain to stop inconveniencing the schedule. What we received was something harder and more useful. Finality in some places. Ongoing work in others. Public naming where there had been private corrosion. Those things are not closure, but they are enough to let a family stop living entirely inside defense mode. Leah did not attend every sentencing hearing because she had already spent enough of her life inside rooms where strangers debated her future. I went to all of them. That felt like my job, to sit through every minute they could no longer filter and to ensure that no tidy summary replaced the actual length of what they had done. Elise looked at me once on the way out and said, "You still needed me after Helen died." I said, "Loneliness is not consent." That was the last complete sentence I ever gave her. Afterward, I went to Helen's grave alone and read the judge's line about privatized coercion out loud. It sounded ridiculous in a cemetery and exactly right in my mouth. Some people deserve to be summarized by the sharpest sentence the law can manage. Afterward, I went to Helen's grave alone and read the judge's line about privatized coercion out loud. It sounded ridiculous in a cemetery and exactly right in my mouth. Some people deserve to be summarized by the sharpest sentence the law can manage. Punishment did not restore 6 stolen years, but it did remove the delusion that charm, philanthropy, and technical language can forever insulate predation from consequence. People like to ask what the revenge was, as if it arrived in one sharp, cinematic gesture. It did not. The real revenge was structural. We took back every instrument they had used and made it testify against them. The letters they hid became exhibits. The signatures they exploited became evidence of fraud instead of consent. The trust documents they built to erase my daughter's voice ended with her reading her own statement into the public record. Stonebrook was sold under court order. The shell entities were dissolved. Their neat little architecture of dependency got itemized, taxed, seized, and turned into restitution. Still, there was one symbolic act I insisted on. After the property sale closed, Leah and I walked through the empty winter garden one final time with a court officer present. In a closet near the side office stood 2 archival boxes labeled correspondence hold. More letters, more theft. We carried every one of them out ourselves. I have thought a great deal about symbolism since then, because people love symbols when they tell stories like mine. The truth is that symbolism only matters after facts hold. The winter garden, the boxes of letters, the court-ordered sale, the public statement, the seized ledgers, the dissolved entities. Each symbol worked because it rested on proof. Without proof, symbols are only grief reaching for a prop. Carrying those archival boxes out of the winter garden was physically easier than I expected and emotionally worse. The room echoed. The shelves had already been stripped. Through the glass, dormant vines clung to the frame like old handwriting. Leah carried one box, I carried the other, and a court officer followed us with a clipboard. Not heroic, not cinematic, just right. They had hidden years in labeled containers. We walked the years out into daylight ourselves. The final civil orders did one more thing I valued deeply. They redirected a portion of the recovered funds into a communications access grant for families navigating contested care environments. Dry name, excellent purpose. If people were going to ask what revenge looked like, I preferred an answer that included doors opening for other families, not just ours. Outside, Leah looked at the estate and said, "They thought paper could outlive us." I answered, "Only if nobody opened it." That was the closest thing to triumph the whole story ever offered. If you insist on one visual for the revenge, let it be this. Leah and I on the courthouse steps, each carrying one archive box full of letters once hidden to keep us apart. Not rage, not triumph. Weight redistributed correctly at last. If you insist on one visual for the revenge, let it be this. Leah and I on the courthouse steps, each carrying one archive box full of letters once hidden to keep us apart. Not rage, not triumph. Weight redistributed correctly at last. We did not burn the estate down or smash the windows or perform some theatrical rite of cleansing. We took inventory, opened every box, traced every dollar, and made order itself punish the people who had abused it. That was enough. We did not become a perfect family after that, because perfect is a fantasy sold mostly by people trying to hide who benefits when reality falls short. What we became was honest. Leah moved into a small brick townhouse with too many plants and windows she chose herself. I learned to knock, to ask, to listen, to stay without solving. She started working part-time with a landscape nonprofit, then full-time. The first time I watched her lead a design meeting in muddy boots with rolled-up plans under her arm, I had to step outside afterward and let the pride pass through me before I trusted my face. Some nights she still calls because a phrase caught wrong in her head, or because silence feels too similar to the old silence. Some mornings, I still wake up angry that 6 years can be stolen without anyone kicking in a door. Grief and gratitude now live closer together than I thought possible. Leah's new life did not emerge in one bright ribbon cutting. It emerged in permissions. She chose her own curtains, refused a suggestion without apologizing, changed therapists once because the first one sounded too impressed by terminology, bought cheap mugs shaped like owls because she said after Stonebrook she wanted at least one object in every room that looked a little ridiculous. Those choices may sound minor. They were sovereignty in household form. I still catch myself apologizing too quickly when Leah is quiet. She still catches herself over-explaining preference as if every answer needs a supporting memo. Then one of us notices, and the noticing itself becomes part of the repair. That is what I wish more people understood. Healing after coercion is not a triumphant montage. It is repeated interruption of patterns that once protected somebody else's power. Leah says now that the hardest part of freedom was not leaving Stonebrook. It was discovering how many tiny decisions a normal day asks of a person. What shirt, what route, what cup, what music, what hour, what no, what yes. People who have never had choice rationed cannot imagine how loud ordinary freedom can sound at first. One spring evening on her porch, she handed me a letter and said, "This one I wanted to give you in person." It said only, "You came back with enough truth." I keep that letter in my wallet where useless men usually keep coupons and proud men keep photos. I keep both there now. The first time Leah changed plans with me at the last minute and did not apologize, I went home and smiled in my empty kitchen for a full minute. Freedom can look that small from the outside and still feel enormous to the people who understand the price. The first time Leah changed plans with me at the last minute and did not apologize, I went home and smiled in my empty kitchen for a full minute. Freedom can look that small from the outside and still feel enormous to the people who understand the price. The repairs are still underway while I tell this. Maybe they always will be. I no longer confuse unfinished with broken. If you have stayed with me this long, then let me tell you the part I understand now that I did not understand when the first invoice arrived. Isolation does not always look like locks. Sometimes it looks like professional vocabulary, tasteful rooms, and the quiet replacement of direct love with managed access. Sometimes the cruelest prison is not built to keep a body in. It is built to keep two people believing the other one stopped reaching. I used to think the worst thing those people took from Leah and me was time. Time matters. Time is holy. But it was not the worst thing. The worst thing was narrative. They tried to become the permanent interpreters of what my daughter felt, what I meant, what our silence proved, what money meant, what care meant, what family meant. Once you let someone else own the language of your love, they can invoice almost any harm. I tell this story now because I know how persuasive managed distance can look when respectable people supply the language for it. If someone tells you the highest form of love is permanent exclusion paired with regular payment, stop and read every page twice. Ask who benefits from the arrangement surviving. Ask whether the person at the center of it is ever allowed to speak without interpretation. Ask whether silence is really healing or merely profitable. When Leah teases me now, when she chooses badly and laughs about it, when she changes plans without first justifying the psychology of the change, I hear not only her voice, but the collapse of theirs. That is the final thing worth knowing. Systems of control promise permanence. They are almost always more fragile than the ordinary human life waiting on the other side of them. Once truth finds enough room, it grows faster than the structure that tried to contain it. I still keep one of the earliest invoices in a folder beside the letter Leah gave me on the porch. Not as punishment, as calibration. One document shows what happens when other people invoice your love back to you. The other shows what remains once the invoices lose their power. That is the whole distance between the life we almost lost and the one we are still building. So when people ask how I knew the lie was finally over, I do not mention the verdict or the sentences or the sale of Stonebrook. I say this. One Sunday, Leah came by unannounced, dropped a paper bag of peaches on my kitchen table, looked around at the mess, and said, "Dad, if you keep storing bolts in this cookie tin, I am calling every sane woman in the county to shame you." I laughed so hard I had to sit down. That was how I knew, not because justice had spoken, because my daughter sounded like herself in my kitchen, and nobody in the room was charging either of us for the privilege. So yes, the story begins with a strong hook, because the truth needed one. But what stayed with me was never the hook itself. It was the long work afterward of teaching ourselves that family can exist again without gatekeepers, invoices, and approved interpretations standing in the doorway. So yes, the story begins with a strong hook because the truth needed one. But what stayed with me was was never the hook itself. It was the long work afterward of teaching ourselves that family can exist again, without gatekeepers, invoices, and approved interpretations standing in the doorway. That is why I tell the story from the beginning in my own voice. Because the second you let someone else narrate your love, your guilt, and your absence without challenge, they start charging interest on the silence. There's one last thing I want to say, because stories like mine often get flattened into a single lesson people can quote without ever having to change the way they live. They say, trust your instincts. Fine. But instincts alone are not enough when a whole apparatus has been built to make your instincts look primitive, emotional, and expensive. The truer lesson is this. If someone insists that love must remain permanently filtered, professionally translated, and financially extracted in order to stay safe, you do not merely trust your instincts. You audit the arrangement. You ask for licenses, locations, independent verification, direct contact, outside review, actual names, actual dates, and the uncomfortable plain version of every sentence they keep trying to soften. If they punish your questions, you already have your answer. For a long time after the trial, I kept expecting some final, private collapse inside myself. Some delayed avalanche where all the years, all the money, all the stolen letters, all the breakfasts with sedatives, all the conference room lies, all the waiting, all the sudden truth would finally stack too high and come down at once. Maybe that is still coming in some smaller weather pattern I have not recognized yet. But what actually happened was stranger and in some ways kinder. Life resumed in pieces that did not ask permission from the old story. The dog still needed to be walked. The warehouse still smelled like cut lumber and diesel on cold mornings. Leah still preferred peaches that bruised too easily because she said they tasted like actual fruit instead of ambition. The world, rude and loyal at once, kept making room for us to continue. I also learned that after coercion, joy can feel suspicious before it feels natural. The first time Leah laughed without checking the room, I noticed. The first time she argued with me about mulch depth in one of my flower beds and refused to let me win just because I was older, I noticed. The first time she left my house without thanking me for an ordinary meal, I noticed that too, and nearly cried over the sink like a fool, because gratitude had been made into such a weapon against her that its absence in the right moment felt healthier than any speech could have. Freedom has strange indicators once you know what captivity trained into somebody. And yes, there are still hard days. Days when she wakes from a dream and hears Rowan's voice in the structure of her own thoughts. Days when I look at a courier envelope and feel my pulse jump before I have even read the return address. Days when some perfectly respectable article about resilience and therapeutic boundaries makes me want to throw the paper across the room, because I now know how easily those words can be weaponized by clever people in tasteful clothes. Healing does not erase anger. It teaches anger how to stop setting fire to the furniture on its way toward the truth. But if you ask me now what remains after everything else has burned off, it is not revenge, not even really justice, though I am grateful for both in the forms we got. What remains is authorship. Leah speaks for herself, I speak for myself. Helen's memory belongs in our mouths, not in some manipulator's care notes as an explanatory device. The years they tried to convert into administrative dependence now live as letters, testimony, warning, and ordinary afternoons no one has the right to filter anymore. If there is any clean ending available to people like us, maybe it is only this. The story is finally back in the hands of the people who lived it. That is why I kept the misrouted transfer, the first stolen letter we recovered, and the final note Leah handed me on her porch in one fireproof box in my study. 3 documents, one showing the lie functioning, one showing the lie interrupted, one showing life after the lie lost its authority. When I feel myself slipping towards some easy summary of what happened, I open the box and remember that no summary is allowed to become simpler than the people who paid for it with their years.